time. I know we have a few more folks trickling in. Help yourself to coffee, get everything, come find a seat. I'm not going to say anything all that important. Meg's actually going to start off with the important things, so I will just be brief. Good morning. My name is Kate Lytle. I'm the Deputy Director at Washington Sea Grant. I use she, her pronouns, and I have the great privilege of welcoming you all this morning. I want to start by acknowledging the people of the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes who have stewarded these lands and waters since time immemorial. It's important to recognize the critical ties that Indigenous peoples currently have to this area, as well as the harms of settler colonialism, so that we may work toward building meaningful relationships and build a just and equitable future together. We strive to learn and do better every day, and our work here today is part of Washington Sea Grant's work in doing this. And Meg, you're gonna come tell me how to make the notes. No, I can't scroll. Oh, yeah. Hold on, some technical difficulties.
Okay, go to Zoom.
Yeah.
Zoom, unmute.
Okay, how about now?
Okay.
Yes.
Go back to presenter,
Yeah.
right there, and I don't know how to make the notes show up. They were there. Ah. That looks like the one.
But I
That's it,
don't.
You did it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
This is how we advance. But
Perfect. Okay, thank you. I can't express how happy and excited it makes me to be gathering together in person. Look, there's so many of you, and we're all in the room together. If I'm honest, I will admit that maybe it's a little bit overwhelming because this is for sure the biggest meeting that I've been at in person in almost 3 years. I don't know about all of you. It's great to be back in the Seaweed space again with many of the same partners who joined us in 2019 and 2020 for our seaweed farming workshop and our intensive 3-day seaweed farming training. I want to offer a particular shout out to our partners then and now, the Puget Sound Restoration Fund and the Nature Conservancy, whose support and guidance has been invaluable in this work. Some of you might remember that we wrapped up the intensive seaweed farm training in early 2020, literally just days before the world changed forever. And thanks to the enthusiasm and community coming out of that workshop and training and the persevering through the last few years and all of the craziness, we've continued this work thanks largely to the heart of Meg Chadsey. And our gathering today is supported. I know, that's there's gonna be another Meg Chadsey shout out, so we'll have lots of time. Our work today is supported by the Builders Initiative, so it's so lovely to be back together again, and we really appreciate all of you. So why are we here today? Meg is gonna give us way more information about why we're here today and orientation and all of those sorts of things, but I just wanted to share my reflection briefly, which is that I am here to learn. Right? There are a lot of questions and a lot of uncertainties about the future of seaweed cultivation in Washington. We all need reliable information to support informed choices about this future. What will it look like? What do we need to know? How do we get there? So I'm here to learn, and I really appreciate all of you being here to learn together. Before I turn it over to Meg to get us started for real, I just want to offer a few quick but very important thanks. In addition to funding, it takes amazing and dedicated people to actually make things happen. So I want to offer huge thanks and recognition to our small and mighty Washington Sea Grant team who put all this together, most significantly with the leadership of Meg Chadsey, who I'm sure most of you know by now. And also huge and significant contributions from Nicole Narr, who's probably still out at the checkout desk sorting name tags, and Terry King. They could not have done any of this without the superstar steering committee that we've had for this event. So I just want to recognize those folks that are up on the screen: Diane Boratin, Charlotte Dorn, Dan Tennis, Cecilia Gobin, Molly Bogerberg, Laura Butler, Joth Davis, Max Calloway, Nicole Narr, Kathy Peters, Molly Aldofson, and Kathy Van Alstein. Huge thank you to each and every one of you for your help in making today happen. I also want to thank All of our presenters, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and perspective with us. And really, thanks again to all of you for coming together to learn. I'm looking forward to it. I hope you all have a great day. And I'm going to pass it over to Meg so that we can actually get started with the fun.
Thank you, Kate. All right. Happy Symposium Day. Why is this not advancing? Clear the prompt. Oh, again. All right, let's do that. Start my video. That one? Okay, there we go. Back to presenter view. This one? Cross fingers? Yes. All right. All right. So I am Meg Chadsey, aka WSG Seaweed, if you haven't figured that out, and 1/3 of the band, the brave band at Sea Grant called the Seaweed Sisters, me, Terry, and Nicole Nahr. And I use she, her pronouns. I am Washington Sea Grant's ocean acidification specialist, but I do a lot of seaweed. So just a quick backstory, and I will speed through the unnecessary parts of this introduction. This was me, I think, end of February 2020. We had just wrapped up our first, in a long time, seaweed trainings, the 2019 workshop and the 3-day intensive training in February 2020. And I had cleaned my desk in my office for the first time in years. That is the cleanest it's ever been. And I was sitting back there thinking, well, that's it. We've taken care of seaweed. All those people who wanted to know things are satisfied, and they won't call Sea Grant anymore, and we've done our job. So, the problem was these people. Some of you may recognize yourselves. This was the conclusion, the third day of our seaweed training workshop. And people, if you can see, there's a lot of smiles in this picture. We're out at the NOAA Manchester facility where the Puget Sound Restoration Fund has their own hatchery. And this group of people did not want to stop after 3 days. And this, for some reason, I didn't anticipate this, but at the very conclusion of this training, a volunteer stood up and said, let's just keep this going. Let's declare ourselves the Washington Seaweed Community of Practice. That's how we started. And then the pandemic came, and then everybody went virtual. And so we were able to keep this community going and growing over the next almost 3 years now. We are now a much more official group. We call ourselves the Washington Seaweed Collaborative. You've seen that webpage, I think, because you had to sign up that way. That website only launched the day we launched registration. That's how new this kind of formal second generation of the Seaweed Collaborative is. But what it's meant to be is an informal network of, at this point, over 170 members. And our commitment is to supporting the cultivation and stewardship of seaweed, which includes kelp, for commercial, cultural, and environmental purposes. So that's a pretty broad umbrella, and I don't think we've yet tried to narrow that focus at all. All right, so this is our brand new shiny website. Most of you have seen this. I think the tagline says it all. This group of practitioners and engaged people is supporting responsible seaweed farming for harvest and restoration. So that currently is about 1/2 of Washington Sea Grant's programming around seaweed. And the other half is this. It's the Seaweed Knowledge Symposium. The funding that we received from the Builders Initiative supports both programs. Why are we doing a Seaweed Knowledge Symposium? Well, kind of for the same reasons that we are continuing to support the Washington Seaweed Collaborative, and that is because the interest that led us to develop those trainings 2.5 or 3 years ago is still there, and of course it's even growing. People are there's something about seaweed. you can see it in people's eyes. When they're coming at you at a meeting, you can say, oh, here comes someone who wants to talk about seaweed with me. It happens all the time. People love it. And when you hear from Betsy Peabody, she captures that excitement so well. But unlike several years ago, there's increasingly the sort of information, the how-to training available from other sources. And so Washington Sea Grant is trying to make the most of our capacity. Where can we help out the most? Is it turning out another guidance manual? Personally, I don't think so, because I would have to write that, and I don't feel qualified yet, even after several years. But what Washington Sea Grant can do is what we often do in many contexts. We convene and we support informed decision-making. That is our role. We bring together all the people who are engaged in an area, and we try to make sure that you all have the best available information or knowledge that you can have to make the decisions that you want to make. And we try to promote collective, collaborative decision-making. So that's why that's what I call next level support for Sea Grant. So these symposium goals, you have these in your program, so I won't go through these. I added a couple specific Washington Sea Grant goals for this symposium late last night. And just to let you know that we are going to be documenting all the conversation and the questions and the good stuff that comes out of this conversation today. We're taking notes. We're going to make these recordings available. We're going to be working to turn out sort of a synthesis document and then share that document with everybody, because we want you to take the outcomes of this symposium and roll with them and collaborate and learn together. And the other goal for Washington Sea Grant is to seed the WSC, the Washington Seaweed Collaborative, with information they can pick up and run with. Our vision going forward for the collaborative is that we'll have some objectives. We'll be turning out information products. We'll be offering guidance. Details remain to be determined, but we're going to learn a lot from this symposium and figure out what the community wants and needs to know, and we're going to try and meet those needs. So, why a Washington seaweed symposium? Well, Washington is, like any seaweed growing region, unique. There is something extra in Washington that makes the seaweed and aquaculture arena unique, I would say, and that is because in Washington state, treaty tribes have had their treaty rights affirmed decades ago by a landmark Bolt decision. And what that legal decision affirmed was that the United States federal government has a trust responsibility to the tribes to protect their trust resources that were agreed upon in treaties and protect those treaty rights. And because of this, the tribes in Washington state, treaty tribes are co-managers of natural resources, of marine resources with the state. And as co-managers of these resources, which encompass many species and habitats, they have the authority to oppose activities that would interfere with their ability to exercise their treaty-guaranteed rights to fish and gather. And so for that reason, this is something everyone who even thinks about farming seaweed in Washington, for whatever purpose, should have in their brains right at the beginning. It is imperative to consult early in your process with any tribes whose usual and accustomed harvest and fishing areas are in the vicinity of your proposed project. Talk with tribal representatives. Do not assume that the outcome will be the one that you desire. It's just not that way. It is the tribe's authority to determine what happens in these waters. And so that is paramount, and it really shapes the way aquaculture develops in this state. And as seaweed farming and seaweed aquaculture and cultivation is new in our state, so there's a lot of development ahead of us. And so let's make sure collectively that we support that development in the best possible way, and that includes respecting and working with tribes. All right, this is a brilliant schematic just to represent another point that you're going to think about today as you hear presentations. This is one genius social scientist's interpretation of the question, what is seaweed aquaculture? What is aquaculture after all? And this is not the answer, this is Nicole's answer. And I like it. I could quibble with some things, and I bet that all of you are thinking, that's not exactly the way I would describe aquaculture. This is aquaculture. I don't think this is seaweed aquaculture. And what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of different perspectives and opinions about what seaweed aquaculture is. And we're not going to solve that problem today. It's not a problem, it's a good thing, but we're not going to come to a common definition today. But what we can do is just keep in our minds the awareness that when you say seaweed farming, cultivation, aquaculture to someone, your mental model might be different from theirs. And so be ready to rethink what you're talking about and adjust. And part of that, I think, leads into, this is what I hope for this community now and into the future. These are the things that I think also we need to be aware of and accept in this seaweed aquaculture realm. As I said, it's new. We're a little bit behind other parts of the US and certainly other parts of the world. I would say it's true that there are more unknowns about seaweed aquaculture, about the science, about the policy, about the impacts to human and non-human communities than there are knowns. But at this early stage, while things are still small in number and small in size, and maybe they will remain that way forever, farms and restoration work, like what Puget Sound Restoration does, offer opportunities for us to figure out some of these unknowns and learn together if we choose to take that opportunity. And the thing about learning is if you learn something and then you don't change the way you're doing something, I think that's the definition of insanity. But we need to foster a culture of adaptive management, about being able to take things we learn and saying, I know we said we'd do it this way for 12 straight years, but now it doesn't seem like the best way to do that. What if we change your practice? We need to have that, I think, we need to have that kind of ability and to do adaptive management. And I know that that's hard, and I know that that poses lots of challenges. People need certainty, people need long-term stability, but we need to be open to the idea that we can change and then be gracious to each other about that. I may be rambling because I'm at this point I'm ad-libbing, but I think the last three things will help us. A mindset of curiosity when we're talking to each other about seaweed cultivation, and acceptance that there is uncertainty, and then a willing to collaborate. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nicole to talk about collaboration and also some just straight up logistics for the day, like where are the bathrooms. Thank you. I'll be back up in 1 second when she's done.
Adjustment for the vertically challenged. Good morning, buenos dias, everyone. I am Nicole Nahr. I use she, her pronouns. I am a social science and education specialist at Washington Sea Grant. And before I turn things back over to Meg, I just wanted to reflect and share with you all a little bit about what the spirit we have in mind for today's symposium is. So we're really here today in a spirit of collaboration, which one definition of collaboration is the action of working with someone to produce or create something. And that's really what we're here to do. We can think of it as collectively putting together a puzzle. And every perspective and person in the room has information and insight, a puzzle piece that is relevant to putting that puzzle together. So we're really going to try and approach our interactions today with this spirit of collaboration. And with that in mind, we have some participant agreements for you all. These are in the agenda as well, if you need to reference them. So the first one is that Q&A is for questions. There will be other platforms at the symposium today for sharing comments and expressing your opinions. So please keep that in mind.
Also, please be aware this is a public meeting, so your questions and comments will be recorded and documented in some way. Thanks, Meg. And attributed to you as an individual. We'll ask that you share your name before commenting. The third agreement is to share your knowledge and perspective openly and honestly, but to make sure that you leave space for others to do the same. Next, we want to make sure that we're listening and remaining open to each other's differing points of view. We want to try to assume best intentions, but not anything else. So ask questions if there's something that you feel like you need to understand a little bit better, or that at first listening sounds unclear or troubling. And lastly, harassment or discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated. So a few elements of logistics for how we're going to run Q&A and discussion today. You have several ways to participate. The first three that I'll go over are what we might call real-time options. So we'll sort of combine and aggregate and alternate between these to strike an equitable balance. But your first option is to come up to one of these microphones if you are willing and able here at the front of the room for each Q&A section. State your name and ask a specific presenter or group of presenters your question. If that seems a little difficult, given where you're seated, we also have question cards. So you should all have a pen and index cards in your seats that you can use to write your name and a question, and then pass them down to end up in the question card bags. And we'll have runners come and collect those cards periodically throughout the panels so that we have those cards and we can read your question to be answered to the panelists here. Yes? Yes, we won't get to all of the questions, right? There's a certain amount of time. But if they're written down, we'll have them to document and follow up with. We'll let our speakers know if you have specific questions for them that they might be able to answer offline. So that's another thing to keep in mind if you wanted to step up to the mic and ask a question and didn't get to it, maybe write it on a question card or submit it via Padlet. So here's the Padlet, the website for the Padlet. You'll have to use cellular data if you're using that. It is a free account. I don't think I've gotten a single email since I signed up for that account, so good thing to know. They don't spam your inbox. If you create a free account, then your comments and questions will automatically be attributed to you. And it sort of has a similar interface as Facebook where you can sort of like comments or questions and respond to them as well, and it will automatically be attributed to your name if you have an account. If you don't have an account, you should still be able to access it, but we're asking that you sort of sign, indicate who you are, and your anonymous post your questions and comments. So Padlet is one of these spaces where there is an opportunity for you to share your comments and opinions in addition to your questions. The last option for participating in Q&A and discussion is the marina or the parking lot. So this is not in real time. I'll be collecting these probably at our bio breaks and lunch breaks and collating them and making sure we have a record of them, but they'll not be incorporated into our sort of live back and forth Q&A and discussion. But you can write your name on a Post-it note and park any thoughts that you have in the marina. So this is a good space for, again, questions that are maybe not super urgent or more general, not directed at like a specific speaker perhaps. Or if you want to share comments or opinions, the marina is a good place to park those thoughts. Now some just real nitty-gritty logistics. Quick guide to name tags. The red name tags are for people with kind of a special role. If you see a Sea Grant sticker, that is a staff member at Sea Grant or one of our volunteers. So if you need help with anything, look for a red name tag and ask those folks who have a Washington Sea Grant sticker. Red name tags with green dots are speakers and presenters. So if you see them, you want to ask them questions, chat them up at lunch or in the bio breaks, feel free to do so. And then red badges with the yellow dot indicates media. So you might be talking to someone who wants to write a story about the Seaweed Knowledge Symposium. So wanted you to be aware of that. Some of your name tags might also have a asterisk for special dietary restriction or food allergy. And And then some of you might have vegan or vegetarian. We didn't get to all of those this morning. Name tags were very sticky. So you know your dietary restrictions. We'll kind of move through in phases for meals today. Well, there's coffee and water in the back there throughout the morning. And we'll also have coffee and cookies in the afternoon. Lunch will be a sandwich buffet, and that is going to be served at noon and run until about 1:20 p.m. We have a lot of folks to move through the buffet line, and we want to make sure that those with restrictions without any restrictions, don't unintentionally eat someone else's lunch. So we'll start with folks who have special, I have a food allergy or a special dietary restriction. Then we'll move to the plant-based diets, vegetarians and vegans. And then we'll announce the remaining omnivores to have what's left. We all know what happens, like Subway or Chipotle, like everybody loves the grilled veggies, and then the vegetarians don't have anything to eat. So we're trying to avoid that situation. Public restrooms are available. I believe they're back there. There is also a single stall restroom if you need to use one of those for any reason. I, the pregnant lady, will be the keeper of the key. That should be easy to remember, pregnant lady bathroom. So let me know if you need one of those. I also want to remind everyone that this is being recorded. There's videotaping and recording in progress. We will be sharing this on the Seaweed Symposium website at the end, after we've done some processing and gotten that ready for you all. If you don't want to physically appear on camera, maybe avoid the microphones at the front of the room. So keep that in mind. Also, face masks are encouraged, strongly encouraged for everyone. It's a active winter respiratory illness season. Hopefully you all are feeling good and asymptomatic here this morning, and hopefully you opted to test and activate the Washington notification system. But yet we encourage you to use masks when you're interacting here today. And a last logistical note on symposium surveys. Hopefully all of you completed the pre-meeting survey. There will also be a post-meeting survey that we'll send out to folks in March. And the idea here is to try to get a sense of did holding a symposium actually serve one of the main purposes, which is to increase connection and communication within the broader seaweed community. So we'll be able to apply some social network analysis techniques to look and see if the frequency or the intensity of communication between different constituent groups changed as a result of the symposium. And this will be done, I know everybody individually is answering these questions, but we're going to aggregate stuff at the institutional level. So we'll be looking at connections, for example, between DNR and Washington Sea Grant. So not individual, but institutional. And we'll be sure to share the fun network diagrams that result from those when we have those ready for you. There will also be an exit survey to just kind of evaluate how the symposium went. That will be sent out probably on Monday. We'll also include some questions from a fellow at the Nature Conservancy who's conducting a seaweed aquaculture situation analysis. So please answer that exit survey. The survey also includes an opt-in or out for sharing participant contact information, so your name and your email. If you don't opt in to sharing your contact information with other participants, you won't receive the list of other participants' contact information. So there's a little bit of reciprocity there. If you want to have other folks' info, you got to give your info. But you'll have a chance in that exit survey to opt in or opt out. And with that, I will turn things back over to Meg for an agenda overview.
Okay. Do we have to do this after every?
No, just,
Okay, just now.
yes, share your screen.
Oh, right there?
PowerPoint, yep,
Okay. Thanks for that.
presenter mode.
Okay, now I have to get back into, ready?
That one,
There.
let's see if it works.
How's it look? Cross fingers.
Ta-da. Let's see, we might be able to make that smaller. Where's your mouse? There it is.
What we're really doing, what I'm doing here while Nicole is optimizing, is welcoming our first panel, which is Terry. Are you prepared, Terry, to transfer the power? So Terry is our moderator for the first session of this session, which is a panel on seaweed and water quality. And there are 4 panelists for this session. Two of whom are coming in remotely. And our panelists need to come up here, who are the ones in person, are ready to come up. Here comes Katie Davis with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And where's our other, oh, and here comes Micah. Micah Horwath with the Washington Department of Ecology. And Terry, Terry, are you going to moderate from back there? Okay. I'm sorry, masks. I really apologize. You can imagine my synapses are a little bit fried this morning. I really apologize. Robin Fales is a PhD candidate at the University of Washington. She's been doing her research. She's going to explain what she's doing. I'm going to turn introductions over to people who are better at them at the moment. What do I need to do for our 2?
All we need to do is hit their slides.
Okay, they're next. I will advance for you if you want.
It's not
That's
showing up.
Terry. It's coming. There we go.
Awesome. Good to go.
Get out of here. I'll give you that.
Okay. So actually, these are in the wrong order, Meg. Okay. So they're just doing their introductions first. So first off will be Nicole Price, and she is coming to us from the Bigelow Laboratory today. And I want to make sure that she's able to present quickly after we present. We're going to divide this panel into 2 sections. One is about human health and contaminants, and the other seriously about water quality. And so Nicole is our first speaker, and if she'd like to introduce herself and say a few words.
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And can you see me? I'm not sure if my video is on appropriately. Okay. Great. My name's Nicole Price. I'm a senior research scientist at the Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences. We're located in East Boothbay, Maine. And for those of you who might not be familiar with us, we're about an hour north of Portland, and we've been there for about 50 years, coming up on our 50-year anniversary. And we work on everything in the oceans, especially foundational species from pole to pole and from deep sea to shallow coastal systems. My background is I'm trained as a marine ecologist with a PhD at UCSB and postdoc at Scripps before coming to Bigelow. I also direct our Center for Seafood Solutions, which puts me into contact quite a bit with aquaculture in the state of Maine and elsewhere. And I have a lot of active research programs right now in the area of seaweed farming. I have had a series of funding opportunities awarded for CO2 capture and ocean acidification mitigation with farmed seaweeds. And just finishing up a project funded by DOE ARPA-E on nutrient bioextraction by farmed seaweeds, getting a SARE program lifted off the ground for cryopreservation of seaweed seeds, and finishing off a project on remote sensing of intertidal seaweeds using drone technology. Most of my research right now is focused on algae as livestock feed with a lot of support from industry, USDA, and philanthropy. And I have an award from the Builders Initiative, who's also supporting this symposium to look at carbon sequestration from farmed kelp. And all of this information, along with any other information we can gather about seaweed farming research in the US, will be put together in a report due to Congress May 2024. And we've held several listening sessions, but I would love to be kept in contact with people who are participating in the symposium to make sure we have all stakeholders' voices included in that report when it's ready to go. And I really look forward to speaking with you all today. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nicole. And next is Ruth Sofield.
Hi, thanks. So my name is Ruth Sofield. I'm a professor at Western Washington University. By training, I'm an environmental toxicologist and chemist. And I have been part of a big body of work recently, or that was recently published. And I have on the right side of the slide a screenshot of the paper and where sampling occurred. And in that work, me and my collaborators, which include Jenny Hahn and Kathy Van Alstyne. Jenny Hahn should be at the meeting, so people can talk to her if they're interested in learning more about this work. She was the primary motivator of the work and did much of the work. But what we did was we looked at organic and inorganic contaminants at 43 locations throughout the Salish Sea, which is what the map is showing where we collected samples. And we looked at 162 different chemicals to look at where and what type of contamination there was. We have ongoing work looking at farmed seaweed. This was harvestable seaweed. We're also now looking at farmed seaweed, and we've expanded the types of contaminants we're looking at. So I'm here as a chemist and a toxicologist. I apologize for not being there in person. I have another all-day meeting that's happening at the same time as this one. But I'll also say, in addition to Jenny, I have 2 grad students that are there. So during breaks, you may be able to interact with them and learn more about what they're doing.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ruth and Nicole, for your introductions. And I guess I'm going to start some of the questions today for these 2 ladies. Yeah, do you want to do that?
Yeah,
okay.
You do yours.
So the first question that we have for the ladies, and hopefully you'll also be able to come up to the mics and ask a question, is what are some of the risks of cultivating seaweed in urban estuaries for human consumption? But also, what are other potential uses, such as animal feeds or soil supplements? And we felt these 2 panelists would have the best information. So So Nicole or Ruth, who would like to answer that question? Could you hear the question?
We did. Nicole, How about I take the risk and you take other uses? How about that one? Okay. So we did in our work look at risk based upon human consumption. And so when we did that work, we looked at what chemicals were found in the seaweed and at what concentrations, and then made assumptions about how much a person would be eating, and then used different ways of assessing how bad that is, and came up with proposed consumption guidelines, which is very similar to what people like the Department of Health do when they think about fish consumption guidelines. And so the risks, it really depends on things like where the seaweed was grown, what parts of the seaweed are being eaten, and something we're investigating now, but we know from the literature, is what time of the year the seaweed would be grown. So the risk is, it varies. There is the potential for there to be, in a worst case scenario, as an option. But one of the things about risk assessments, and we did not do a risk assessment, we used a risk-based approach. One of the things about, or there's lots of things to be careful of with risk assessments or risk-based approaches, and that is they often have many layers of uncertainty built into the assessment, and so they tend to be quite conservative. So even though I said maybe cancer, that's a very conservative assessment that's gone into that, if that is the case. But some other things to consider are that there's health benefits, and often when you use a risk-based approach and don't consider benefits, you aren't providing the whole picture of what a consumer choice should be based on. And so that's important. And then another consideration is thinking about the health risks associated with consuming. You also have to think about the fact that that might mean people become afraid to eat a product like seaweed, and then may replace that with a different type of food that may not be as healthy. So it's a complicated answer, and it really depends. And once you get to thinking about like what are the health risks, it often becomes a personal choice that people have to think about on their own and weigh all of these different aspects of consuming something like seaweed. So that's where I would kind of leave that answer.
Okay. And then for Nicole, I noticed, you've noticed talking, for animal feed. What sorts of things do you think of when you think of seaweed culture and animal feed, soil amendments?
Yeah. So there's risk and there's opportunity, and I'll echo the risk that Ruth spoke about. And it's not even just risk for heavy metals like arsenic coming through into the seaweed that can be quite good at taking up arsenic. It's also risk of other elements like iodine that can be concentrated in seaweeds and can be delivered inadvertently at a toxic level to animals through feed. So you have to have a full picture of the full suite of elements that's going into that feed product and know what the limitations are for the animal feed. The opportunity is that during the processing of seaweed, you can sometimes chelate out or eliminate some of this risk by removing and rinsing out some of those elements. Also see the ability for seaweeds to take up some of these elements as an opportunity for phytoremediation of the water quality in a damaged region. And then if you're careful about the bioprocessing or biorefinery technique that you use for the seaweed, you can remove those harmful elements and still have a useful product on the back end. I think Meg is frozen. I'm a little worried that I'm coming through okay.
You're coming through fine. I
Okay,
promise.
great.
Meg's camera is just off. So.
Okay. I also wanted to, I'm not quite finished, a couple more statements. We have a lot to learn about the bioavailability of any of these elements in an animal, in a human, and in soils. So I think there's still a large opportunity for filling some research gaps there and just doing some basic flux models of what actually passes through animals or people in terms of any of these elements. It's also really important to be aware that there are several forms of them. Arsenic can come in an organic and an inorganic form, for instance. The inorganic form is what's toxic and not the organic form. So speciation of these elements is crucial, but challenging. NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology, has been hosting a QAP, Quality Assurance Program, for testing for some of these elements in seaweeds because there's concern that not all labs are reporting comparative values for the same sample type. So NIST is coming up with a certified reference material for kelp, in particular sugar kelp, and then offering this opportunity for labs to learn how well they perform against each other and against some gold standard approaches. A lot of it can come down to your protocol for breaking apart the seaweed matrix in the first place to measure those elements. And so I see another opportunity for developing some standard operating procedures for those sorts of steps. And I'll just stop there.
Awesome. Does anyone in the room have a question for these two panelists? If you do, if you could step up to the mic, that would be helpful, or pass your card to someone so that they can hear. If not, I've got another question in my pocket if need be. All right, not seeing anybody come to the mics. So, ladies, what are some of the gaps in knowledge that we have relative to seaweed and water quality and human health and animal health? And what sorts of studies do we need to do? What are those future things that we need? Nicole, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. One thing that we're working on right now is when you feed seaweed to an animal, what parts of that get passed through into the manure, and what does that mean for using manure spreaders for a fertilizer then down the line? It's just an example. There are state-by-state regulations about how much manure and the kind of quality and contaminants in that manure that then can be applied to the field as well. So these fluxes of consuming of the seaweed, the bioavailability, again, of the seaweed to the animal, and what is coming out the other end and where that is going is a large unknown for this research. And also that opportunity to apply seaweed for phytoremediation purposes to Superfund sites, for example, could be really cool. The biorefinery approach to make these things safe or chelate out is a complete unknown area and open for research.
And Ruth?
So I think about this as as a toxicologist and chemist, and I think with a focus on the environment. So thinking about, we know there's a lot of things we know. We know that seaweed can hyperaccumulate metals. We also know that they can take nutrients out of the water, so they can take out bad things, which can be beneficial to the environment. But then there's a question of what about the consumers of that seaweed, depending on what's been accumulated. So if it's a toxic substance, then that's good that it's removed from the water, for example, but then what about what eats that seaweed? And so I think about that, but I also think about what about like when the seaweed breaks off and then it becomes a transport vector. So it's carrying whatever it's accumulated with it and moves it to a new location. And how significant is that? Is that important? Particularly thinking about if this were to ever be used as a type of bioremediation, which I think would have to be really carefully considered. What happens once the materials accumulated in the organism, especially if it's something like a metal that can't be biotransformed, so it's going to remain in the tissues of the organism. And then another thing that I think we can piece together based upon other types of work, but I don't know that it's specifically been done to completion with seaweed, and that's thinking about what conditions would be best used, or what are the best conditions for using seaweed to remove substances from water. So thinking about what is the residence time of water, what's the relationship of the site to urban settings when you think about non-point runoff, back to like the characteristics of the location of the seaweed. In addition to residence time, what's the depth of, is it a shallow bay? Is it a deep bay? So I think there's a lot that needs to go into thinking about what would be the best conditions through which seaweed could be used to clean up. And I do know, I think our next, some other people on the panel can speak to that a little bit more specifically.
Great, wonderful, thank you. So if there are no questions from the room, you have one? If you want to come to the mics, that would be great.
My name is Riley Starks.
Hold on, Riley. Ladies, can you hear him? All right, good,
Yeah.
Good to go.
So it sounds to me like growers will be having to test their product, if it's especially for human consumption. And so my question is this happening already? Because there's a lot of seaweed in the market. And number two, are there like normal protocols that testing labs have access to that we can take our product for testing?
Yes, there are expectations for testing for both human products and animal products. And frankly, some of the testing requirements for animal products are more stringent than for humans. But I wouldn't say that there's a standard operating protocol at all for most of these elements. And that's what NIST recognized as a problem. And so starting to identify how we can put those together. I would say that there's also sort of an opportunity with iodine, and especially with soil applications. We've stripped iodine out of most of our agricultural soils. And so it's an opportunity to replace some of those elements as well, if we can measure it well. Who's measuring these things now? For animal feed, it's labs that do forage analysis. And often they miss the mark on the values reporting for seaweed because they have not digested the seaweed tissue appropriately. And so it's some of those labs that we're trying to encourage to participate in the NIST program to learn about how to pre-treat the tissue. Yeah, and I would add for the toxic substances for human health consumption, there aren't seaweed-specific guidelines for what is allowed in food. And so in Washington State, for toxic substances for human consumption, it would take the Department of Health to come up with consumption guidelines for that to become something that was required. And as of right now, that hasn't happened.
So, but there's plenty of contract labs where these analyses can be done, and we certainly could provide those as needed information on those.
Wonderful, thank you. We have one more question, and then we'll move to our next panelists.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Also vertically challenged. Hi, Laura Hobrecht. I'm with NOAA Fisheries, our Alaska Fisheries Science Center. And this kind of builds on the last question and wondering what tools and approaches we can build on from terrestrial ag and, you know, the long legacy there of testing and food safety and making sure people feel comfortable with what they're eating, and other countries that have been growing seaweed for a lot longer than, you know, the U.S. is kind of just getting into this market. So what opportunities there are to learn from existing models, and then what makes seaweed unique compared to, you know, the traditional terrestrial ag foods that we would want to consider. And you've touched on some of those already, but just, yeah, wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
So I can try a stab at this one. There were some testing labs that were getting established in Ireland that would be really comprehensive for seaweed. But as far as I know, they have not taken off and are no longer accepting inquiries for sample analyses. But it's a problem worldwide, actually, to have a consistent set of protocols for seaweed testing. You can use the same equipment, ICP-MS, HPLC, GCMS, to measure these things in seaweed that you would measure in other produce from terrestrial ag systems. The issue comes at digesting the tissue before you put it into these instruments. And you have to, as far as we are learning, have to use, for certain things, very extremely basic or extremely acidic conditions in microwave digesters to make sure that you've extracted all that is in there. And in some cases may need to use a bead beating protocol as well. These all exist, they just haven't been pulled together comprehensively for everyone to refer to, I would say.
Great, Ruth, anything to add? Nope, all right. Well, I want to thank you both. Please stay online, and we're going to introduce your other two panelists right now. So let me bring them up. All right. So our next panelist, and you can either stay there and use the microphone or come up here, your choice, is going to be Robin Fales. Oh, we need to turn it on. You got it? Okay.
What about now? Okay. Thank you. So I'm Robin Fales. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Washington in the biology department and at Friday Harbor Labs, and I study kelp stressors, and I also have a master's where I studied rockweeds and long-term change. So I have lots of experience thinking about brown seaweed. My current work focuses on understanding change in natural kelp populations to inform conservation of habitat-forming seaweeds, but the questions that I ask about how do seaweeds grow or where and under what conditions do they grow the best are really relevant for aquaculture, and where do we put a kelp farm, or how do we have the highest yield? And so just some other background on what some of my expertise is. I also have expertise in oceanographic conditions across the Salish Sea, where we have really different temperatures and salinities and nutrients in different regions, as well as thinking about aerial and marine heat waves and seaweed physiology and life history. So I think I'll pass the mic off for the next introduction.
Yes, thank you very much. Oops, it's deciding not to behave. There we go, Micah. It's all up to you.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Michael Horwath. I'm the Ocean Acidification Senior Scientist at the Washington State Department of Ecology. So who here is following the issue of ocean acidification? Anybody in the audience? All right. So I lead the agency's scientific work on understanding how carbon pollution is affecting marine chemistry across Washington State, and then connecting that science to our policy efforts to reduce carbon pollution and to protect our resources from changes in pH and other elements in the water. I have some experience kind of studying how ocean acidification connects with kelp and seagrass, potentially using those two groups of organisms as a tool to pull down carbon dioxide in the marine environment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and hopefully just begin this conversation about how kelp and other seaweeds fit into the big picture of carbon and nitrogen cycles in our waters.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. We're going to use the same question and answer, so if you have a question for these two, we're going to have you come up to the mic and ask, but I'm going to start. Since, Mike, I don't think we have a second slide for you, and the question is, seaweed cultivation is often portrayed as a silver bullet to a lot of environmental problems. Which aspects of these claims do you think are merited? What aspects might be overhyped?
Wow, yeah. That's a big question. I guess at a really high level, I'll just start, since I have no slides, by trying to paint a picture. So over the course of a year, what happens with carbon dioxide in Puget Sound is you get a big U shape, where at the beginning of the year in the winter, there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the water. It goes down in the spring and summer, and then back up in the fall into the winter. And the reason that's happening is because of biological production. So photosynthesis from phytoplankton and from kelp and from seagrass in the spring starts to wake up and pull carbon out of the water. And that produces conditions that are more favorable for calcifying organisms and others that are sensitive to pH. The problem that we have introduced through fossil fuel use and land use change is that U shape is every year climbing a little bit higher. The baseline of carbon dioxide in the water is going up and up and up from the added CO2 that's being absorbed from the atmosphere. And so to begin answering this question, the idea is that kelp or seagrass might be a tool to pull that U shape down a little bit to counteract some of the carbon dioxide that we're putting into the water. I guess I can start by talking about some of the limited empirical work that's been done on this subject in our state. And I was only on the side of this effort. There's others in the room who were really deeply involved, but there was a project in Hood Canal where a kelp farm, sugar kelp, was put into practice. It was about 2.5 acres over 2 cultivation years in 2017 and 2018. And part of that project was just kind of testing cultivation techniques to see what works in producing a crop and what doesn't. But another big aspect was looking at the biogeochemical factors there, so measuring what is the effect of a commercial scale kelp farm on water quality parameters. Part of that was looking at nitrogen and part at carbon. In the end, to sum up the study pretty quickly, the effects on the immediate water chemistry, well, I guess first I want to break up 2 potential benefits that kelp can have. One of them is the immediate effect on surrounding water chemistry. So that is sometimes called a sweetening effect. And that's when the kelp is photosynthesizing in the water right next to it, carbon dioxide is being pulled out, pH goes up, it's better for calcifying organisms, that's the idea. And the other benefit is that the kelp incorporates some of that carbon dioxide into its tissues, which can then be sequestered on a given time scale. So the kelp can die, sink to the bottom of Puget Sound, or potentially it can be harvested and stored permanently in some way. And to me, those are 2 different benefits that kelp could have. For the first one, which is the immediate effect on water chemistry, we found no detectable effects of the kelp on the water. And that is largely because we think the water motion, the current velocity at this site, is really fast, as it is in a lot of parts of Puget Sound. So the water remained in contact with the kelp for such a short amount of time that it could not draw out enough carbon dioxide to produce any detectable chemical change. There was also a modeling effort that went along with this project, and the modeling, it's a simulation, but as best we could tell, the maximum effect that the kelp had was in the dead center of the farm, which makes sense, and that was the drawdown of 1 micromole per kilogram of carbon dioxide. And to put that in context, that's about the amount that the global oceans are changing every year. So in the very, very center of the farm, we're getting maybe a counteracting effect of 1 year of human influence. So very modest. And this could be a different result if the farm was sited somewhere differently, where water motion was slower, where the water volume, the water column was shorter. So this Hood Canal site, it was deep, a deep place. There was a lot of water and a lot of carbon in that water. So that was maybe a disappointing result, but it was the best effort that we could make at trying to measure is there any kind of halo of benefit around this farm, and we could not measure one. To the other part of the question, what if we pull the kelp out of the water and convey that biomass somewhere else to get the carbon out of the marine system? Here again, we had some results, and in 1 year of the crop, it was about 20 metric tons of kelp biomass, and that's wet weight just pulled out of the water at peak biomass. As you know, kelp is mostly water, so the amount of carbon in all of that tissue was about 400 kilograms. The amount of nitrogen in that biomass was about 50 kilograms. So even if we were somehow able to completely store that carbon in a lockbox, it is a small amount. 400 kilograms is about equivalent to a third of the emissions from one passenger vehicle over 1 year. And of course, that doesn't take into account any carbon emissions that were spent in cultivating the kelp itself. The diesel burned in getting a vessel out and back, driving to the site and driving back. So doing a careful accounting of how much carbon it takes to get these activities done against the carbon that's captured in the tissue of the kelp is an important part of evaluating the benefits. So I'll stop there for now and pass to Robin.
Yeah. Robin, any thoughts?
I think Micah did a really great job of summarizing those things, but I will add, thinking about that U-shaped curve for taking up CO2, because seaweeds they photosynthesize, but just like all other organisms, they also have to respire. So the amount of time when they're photosynthesizing, capturing carbon is different, and they're still going to be performing metabolic functions through respiration at night or when there's not a lot of light available. I'll also add that to take a different direction is that I think a lot about temperature, and our oceans are warming and we have more frequent marine heat waves due to anthropogenic climate change, and that is also a threat to seaweed because kelps thrive in cold, nutrient-rich waters, and so it's just a double-edged sword where you have to think about our kelps. We can't necessarily use kelp or grow a bunch of kelp if the temperatures of the water are too warm for them to grow, and they are temperature sensitive. The other piece I think that I can add is that nutrient dynamics. It's been really important that we've controlled eutrophication and over pollution of our waters, especially since kelp and seaweeds are not the only things that are taking up nutrients and growing when there's nutrients available. There's also phytoplankton and diatoms, which can shade kelp and then end up competing for light. So those are just a couple pieces that I wanted to add on.
Great. So anybody have a question from the room?
So really quick, I have a point to make as well. And I just want to echo what Micah said, that the context really matters for your expectations of what rates of carbon capture could be and what the effect on water quality could be. So we've done a very similar study to what has been done in Puget Sound in a small enclosed bay in Maine called Casco Bay. That's also a shallower bay. And the seaweed farms are larger than what was used in Puget Sound. And in those cases, we were able to detect what we're calling the halo effect or the sweetening. You could see a difference in the seawater pH and CO2 concentration inside versus outside the farm. And when you transplant mussels into the seaweed farm, they grow harder, thicker shells than outside the farm in just a 3-month time period. So context really matters, and we're continuing that research. We've demonstrated the halo effect for 3 years in a row, and now we're moving to research in Norway and Alaska to try to figure out if we can better define for seaweed farmers what the circulation patterns, what the water depth or bathymetry, and what the size of a seaweed farm would need to be if you were going to try integrated multitrophic aquaculture to allow for that beneficial effect to spill over onto your shellfish. Thanks.
Great. And Nicole, while we have you online, we do have a question that came from the room. Has kelp farming been used for bioremediation already? And do you have any thoughts on what kind of scale would be required? And this really fits into this last question. And then also for nutrient removal, and I think Micah kind of answered some of that, but the bioremediation question?
Yeah, for nutrient removal, again, it's an issue of scale. If we wanted to address all of the nitrogen runoff from stormwater drains and wastewater treatment in Casco Bay, even though it's a small bay, we would have to fill the bay completely with farmed seaweed to even have any measurable effect at all on that amount of nitrogen. However, if we look at the kind of craggy coastline of Maine and move to the Booth Bay region, we have a paper that came out recently about how even a small seaweed farm in that case could operate at a large enough scale to impact the wastewater treatment plant in that area and help it move to tertiary treatment. In terms of phytoremediation projects for metals, I know that there are studies out there that exist. I'm not as familiar with that literature, so I don't feel confident answering that question, but I could help someone find resources if they're really interested.
Wonderful, thank you. Any comments from Micah or Ruth on this?
I think I would just echo the same thing about scale and nitrogen removal. I did some back of the envelope calculations, and similarly to Casco Bay, I guess, so Puget Sound, we have a lot of people living around it. The wastewater treatment plants and river inputs are the primary sources of anthropogenic nitrogen into Puget Sound. And if you just scale up the amount of nitrogen that was removed at the sugar kelp farm in Hood Canal, if all the kind of 1,000 square miles of Puget Sound were converted to kelp farm, it still would not quite counteract the amount of nitrogen that gets deposited by wastewater treatment plants, which is around 30,000 kilograms per day in Puget Sound. And of course, that's not the use to which we want to put Puget Sound, to be a blanket kelp farm. So the other thing is that nitrogen would have to be, the kelp would have to be removed and then put somewhere else where none of the nitrogen would wash back into Puget Sound for it to have an effect. All of these elements that we're talking about, I certainly know less about the toxics and heavy metals, but nitrogen and carbon are very fungible. So they move through different compartments of the ecosystem easily. And so when we're talking about potential benefits for nitrogen or carbon, we can't just treat the biomass of kelp as an endpoint. We have to think about where do those elements go after the kelp decays, after it gets consumed, and what are the net changes to where it ends up in the atmosphere or the water.
Great, Robin. Any other comments? Nope, we're good. Okay. Any questions from the room? If you'd like to come up to the mic, Riley, if you want to come up over here, I'll just rotate back and forth.
Riley Starks again. And Micah, what were the current velocities at the 2.5 acre farm?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm going to risk going off the top of my head. I think they were 10 to 12 centimeters per second.
Okay. And if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Merle Knapp. I've got a small consulting company, Seastar LLC, and I've been in the Alaska seafood business for 57 years. So I just retired from the Alaska pollock industry after 30 years. And my question is, was the nitrogen measurement, or back of the envelope, was that taken from wastewater discharges from like King County and the other areas, and did you have additional amounts that weren't part of that number?
Yeah, the back of the envelope calculation I mentioned, I got the figure of, it's about 32,000 kilograms per day that comes from point sources in Puget Sound into the water, and that's wastewater treatment plants almost entirely, and then another 30,000 from river inputs. So scaling up the projected kelp farm, for which we have data in Puget Sound, that was what I was mentioning, would not offset the wastewater treatment plants. I guess the part I didn't mention is that the big majority of nitrogen inputs to Puget Sound are not from human sources. It's from the open ocean, something like 85 to 90% in a given year. So that most of the nitrogen is not coming from human sources. So the effect that kelp would have on the overall nitrogen is even smaller. It would not draw it down to close to zero.
Wonderful. We have another question.
Hi, my name is Stephen with Salish Sea Greens, and my question's in regard to water temperature. Is there any research being done on heat-resistant kelps or strains of kelp that might be resistant to heat, and whether or not that can be used for farming and restoration?
So we'll go to Robin first, and then we'll go to you, Nicole, okay? Sounds good.
So in Washington, we are just now getting a better grasp on how kelp respond to temperature, and so that's been work that's been done by myself, Brooke Weigel, and Miranda Rothler. And so I think that we're just starting. This is like data has just been collected, and we're just starting to get that picture. And I think some of those like kelp-resistant strains, at least for Washington State, that's a next step, but has not been really started as much.
Great. And Nicole has some ideas also?
Yeah, there's a lot more research happening for sugar kelp in this area. So South Korea has been working for a while through selective breeding to get heat resistant and more productive strains. Their fronds sizes are huge. And then there's been some research supported by the Department of Energy ARPA-E Mariner program given to the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute in Scott Lindell there, who did a lot of research on natural or breeding selectivity of temperature-resistant strains. The issue is whether or not your state is willing to let you plant out selectively bred species. Maine has not been okay with that so far, but it's partly because we don't understand quite enough about the connectivity between natural populations and the genetic diversity of those natural populations. So that's another huge area that requires some research. Bigelow is the congressionally recognized repository of thousands of strains of microalgae and macroalgal species. We have those selectively bred thermo-tolerant species of kelp maintained in our culture collection. So that all that effort to create those strains is not lost, but finding a place to farm them out and follow through with the experiment to see if they truly are resistant has not happened yet.
Great, thank you for that. And we have one last question from the room. And if anybody has a question after this, if you could put it on a card and we'll get it to our presenters later. So go ahead, please.
Hi, I'm Jackie Dexter with Holdfast Mariculture. And my question to all of you is, would incinerating seaweed like they do in mycoremediation, which I've done some work in before, and maybe there could be some collaboration with mycoremediation and phytoremediation, is there a way that you could environmentally friendly incinerate seaweed to remove those toxins completely out of the system? I know that there's been some work in mushroom stuff before like that.
So, Robin, Micah, anything? No? Okay, Nicole, anything from your end that you know about microremediation and the burning of seaweeds?
I'll let Ruth answer first. The limited knowledge I have is about biochar.
All right.
So incineration is, I mean, it's a well-established technology to concentrate organic material into smaller amounts that leaves things like the elements, so the metals are left behind, and then you worry about what's released atmospherically. And so it just depends on what's accumulating in the seaweeds and then what incineration temperatures you're using. So I think I think to get there, we would really need to have a good understanding of what is in the seaweed. So some good characterization of what's in the seaweed. So thinking about things like the dioxins and the PCBs, those are often harder to manage with incineration than some of the other chemicals. So I think it just kind of depends on what's present.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And I want to thank all of these panelists for their work today and sharing their ideas and their thoughts with us. I'll let you. Okay. I got you 10 minutes.
Betsy, you can advance with this. Just point it there, or I can do it for you. I can do it.
And I need to do this so that it's not touching the computer.
The closer this gets to that, the more that ringy sound.
How's this? Ringing? Okay.
Which means you have to lean forward.
Okay. How about this? No, you don't have to hold it. That seems silly. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. First of all, I just want to look at all your faces for a minute. I've worked with many of you, and I just want to thank you for all of the things that you've taught me over the years, and I wish I could call you out individually, but perhaps I can do that in various ways throughout. My name is Betsy Peabody, and I'm Executive Director of Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and we've been working in the kelp space for about a dozen years. And I'm pulling back from the seaweed farming, kelp farming theme for a minute and talking more about bull kelp restoration. So the restoration of kelp forests, the canopy kelp forests in Puget Sound, which is bull kelp. And we're developing practices, but we're going to begin in the bull kelp space and then sort of wend our way into various some seaweed farming, seaweed collection activities. But the first thing that really pulled us into this space was a tribal leader who had observed, he and the Suquamish tribe, this is Leonard Forsman, the chair of the Suquamish tribe, had observed dramatic declines of kelp forests within their usual and accustomed fishing area, which is the area where we are located as an organization. And he said, you should really try to figure this out. And so we were, as an organization, a nonprofit organization, trying to figure out how to restore living species and habitats that are important ecologically, but also important culturally as food sources. So we were working on oysters, we were working on abalone, and then here somebody said, you should really start working on kelp. So that pulled us into this space in 2010. And I just want to note that we have a big kelp team at Puget Sound Restoration Fund. Brian Allen is here. We have 3 other people on the core kelp team, and we also have others in the organization working on kelp, including Emily Buckner here in the front row. So when I say we, I'm talking about the we of the organization, but I'm also talking about the we of all the organizations and partners and funders with whom we work. So, kelp declines is what brought us as an organization into this, and so these 2 maps show you what kelp extent looked like in Puget Sound in 1978. You see all that rich yellow, and then what kelp looked like, kelp presence extent looked like in 2000, and then just know that since 2000 there have been significant declines. So you can see that this has been a dramatic loss, and it's a dramatic loss that some people are monitoring very closely, including Department of Natural Resources, including academics and researchers, including tribes. But it's also a loss that maybe hasn't been seen and recognized more broadly by many people. So we think of ourselves as being the evergreen state, covered with terrestrial forests, and I think a lot of people are not considering underwater kelp forests as part of that forest extent that has been lost. So I want for us all to push open that definition of forest and get people to start thinking about the above and below forests when we're talking about declines and the need for recovery of these places. So we thought, sort of similar to maybe the way Meg thought when she pulled off the seaweed farming workshop in 2020, we thought, okay, we're going to try to figure this out because somebody just sort of invited us into this space and directed us towards kelp and figure out how to do this thing called restoring kelp forests. And it has been a lot more complicated than we anticipated in the beginning. It's a very complex ecosystem in which we work. It's also a complex regulatory environment in which we work. And there are a lot of things, activities that occur in the marine space, and there are a lot of agencies and people who have strong opinions and authority over what happens in the marine space. So kelp restoration, interestingly, has got to thread the same needle that kelp farming has to thread, or other types of development in the marine system. So that just sort of adds to the complexity of trying to do this thing. But I will say that we're trying to work out a restoration practice. What does that look like? What is an efficient way to try to grow a kelp forest in the marine system at a place where it has disappeared or where significant declines have occurred? And we've kind of settled on an aquaculture practice. So the same way that kelp seed is outplanted at a kelp farm, we're kind of using those same ways to outplant a kelp forest. Only instead of having cultivation lines that might be mid-column, 3 meters below the surface, we've got our cultivation lines that are closer to the benthic surface, so maybe 1.5 feet above that, anchored at both ends. So some of the same infrastructure. So a technique that has successfully been used to grow kelp for all kinds of reasons all over the world. We're taking that technique and saying, okay, can this help to grow a kelp forest back? Can it help bolster seed supply in an area? Can it lead to natural recruitment in that area? So this is kind of what we're testing out over a period of time. So you can see that we've sort of run through a few experiments over the years. You can see the cultivation line on which our bull kelp is growing. We've also tested out using these pyramid-shaped anchors to kind of grow a cluster of kelp within a space. So we're working our way through various experiments, and ultimately what we're doing now is that cultivation line, growing a patch, a dense patch, trying to produce enough reproductive material from that living kelp forest in that space so that it rains down and gives rise to the kelp forest the next year. It's trying to get at that magnitude question. How big does that patch need to be? How dense does it need to be in order to really kickstart that natural recruitment? And we're not there yet, and I hope that someday soon we get there, or that we see kelp recruitment in the spring. As part of this work, we've also needed, in terms of developing our kelp restoration practice, developing our capacity to restore kelp forests that are fundamental as part of the ecosystem and are declining. We've also established a kelp lab at NOAA's Research Center, Manchester Research Center, and this is where we operate a conservation hatchery called the Kenneth K. Chu Center for Shellfish Research and Restoration. It's also where we have a kelp lab, and that's where we've been propagating seed. It's also where we're establishing a seed bank so that we have archived the genetic material from kelp forests around Puget Sound, and we're working with somebody at University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Felipe Alberto, and he has assembled that archive of genetic material, and we're going to be importing it, thanks to some import permits from Department of Fish and Wildlife, importing that into Puget Sound, into the kelp lab in early 2013, so that potentially we can also develop over time custom blends so that we can figure out what seed will grow best in which areas. So I actually forgot to bring up with me, but as part of our own learning on how to propagate seed, how to make it available for restoration purposes, we've also sort of tried to gather all of our learning in one document, and Emily is going to show. We've just finished this propagation manual, And this is something that we are happy to share with tribal partners and others who are interested in growing kelp for restoration purposes. And this just sort of assembles the lessons that we've learned over the years. And so we have, I think, copies with us. And then we also have Emily, raise your hand, and Brian, raise your hand. Brian's our propagation maestro, and so if there are people who want to connect with them and avail themselves of these resources, they're here. We've also been working with many people here in the audience to produce a kelp conservation and recovery plan that was finalized in 2020. And Department of Natural Resources, Northwest Straits Commission, Tom Mumford here, raise your hand, Tom, who's just one of the most amazing kelp gurus, NOAA, and others, to sort of take a broader look on, first of all, what does kelp do in Puget Sound? How significant is it? There are over 20 species of native kelps in Puget Sound. What do we need to learn about them? What are the priorities? What do we need to know in terms of understanding stressors, monitoring distribution and trends, learning about restoration, increasing awareness and understanding? There are all kinds of things we need to do to help bring kelp to the surface of our consciousness more than it has been writ large. At least in recent times, though of course tribes have been connected to these forests and to all of the resources that come out of the forests for thousands of years. So this gives us a kind of a roadmap. So that particular plan came out in 2020, but what we really wanted to do at Puget Sound Restoration Fund and with all of our partners was just to sort of breathe life into that kelp plan. We don't want it to be just a document. We actually wanted to gather with partners, with tribes, with communities, with scientists at kelp forests throughout Puget Sound, beginning in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and wending our way all the way down to the head of Puget Sound near Olympia at the Squaxin Island kelp forest. And again, gather with people along the way to learn. Pew Charitable Trust was one of our partners and helped us venture into this space. Brenda is here. Brenda, raise your hand. We partnered with over 40 different organizations, scientists, agencies, many of whom are here today. And really it was just sort of a deep immersion with other people. This was kind of just coming out of the pandemic and we'd all been holed up. And it was a way to kind of spring ourselves forward, get ourselves out into the system again, looking with multiple eyes, multiple perspectives, different kinds of knowledge banks at these kelp forests so that we could merge our understanding together and really grow this conservation and recovery effort moving forward. So it was really an incredible opportunity. Hannah Garfield with Puget Sound Restoration Fund, she developed a kelp story map, and hopefully you can take a look at that on our website, restorationfund.org, and it really tries to bring in all these multiple layers of understanding and appreciation for the value and the importance of kelp in our ecosystem. We also put together a video working with Florian Grainer called Kelp Lifeways to try to bring to the fore some of the things that we had been learning about kelp during the expedition with our tribal and scientific partners, but also just along the way of our own particular kelp journey. And it's a great video, and it sort of puts it in context of kelp forests, kelp lifeways, providing a route by which early humans, trailblazers, could follow along the coast and people the Americas and continue down to South America. So these places full of an abundance of food. It's a safe passage because kelp forests slow the water down. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who taught us so much during the expedition and who shared the ways in which we should be talking about this. I came into it thinking of this as the Kelp Highway, and Jeff Dickinson, among others, said, you know what, this is not a highway. This is a life way. It is living. It is present. This is not a thing of the past. This is an important cultural, ecological resource that today continues to provide and support the base of our food systems here. So we've just sort of got to get ourselves talking about this in the right way. And one of the things that I've learned over the years, and it really sort of began through discussions with tribal partners, but it was also, I was nudged in many ways by Tom Mumford over the years, and he has been proselytizing for a good long while about how about many things, but about how, kelp was not just a habitat structure. And that's how I came into this. I was seeing it as a biogenic living habitat structure. And that for me was all encompassing. That was such an incredibly important thing to try to rebuild. But he really said, it is not just a habitat structure. This is powering our food web. And I think the problem for me, he was really kind of hitting me on the head multiple times over the years, and I was hearing it from him, but as a non-scientist, I don't think that I was incorporating it into my cranium, or it just took me a long while to understand that. So what I want to show with this slide is that the fish that you can see are not just in the forest, they are made of the forest. And so I needed to just sort of find the different words that I needed in order to understand that concept. And if those fish are made of kelp, made of the forest, then that means that we are made of kelp and of the forest. And there is incredible research being done by Paul Chitterow at NOAA to sort of trace that kelp carbon using isotope studies through multiple species and really give us the percentage breakdown so that we know that there are certain rockfish species and of the carbon that's in their biomass, like 50% of it is kelp carbon. So we're eating these things. We are part of the kelp lifeway, and you know what? We need to just make sure that more people feel that they are part of the kelp lifeway, so that we really sort of bring that broader attention to these particular issues, because restoring and conserving kelp forests in Puget Sound is incredibly important. So I'm just happy to be working with so many of you to try to do that. So here, these foods, I think a lot of people go to restaurants and they eat these foods without understanding that they're connected to kelp. So let's be creative about how we try to get that story out there. Hannah Garfield, also our creative engagement specialist at Puget Sound Restoration Fund, she's working to try to illustrate some of Paul Chitterow's work to show how kelp carbon is moving through the system. And you can see the yellow of the bull kelp, that canopy forest, and you can see the many species that are incorporating it, absorbing it in many ways, how it's moving through the system. And the other incredible thing about kelp forests is that they're not just in that nearshore space, so we can't just think of them as that forest below, okay? Because those nutrients are being thrown up on the shore as well. As that annual kelp species runs through its yearly cycle and it gets tossed up, thrown up on the shore, where it becomes part of that terrestrial nutrient cycling, in the same way that salmon are going out and harvesting ocean nutrients and bringing them back into the watershed in a way that enriches the soil and enriches the forests. So there are all these sea-land nutrient conveyances, and that's important too. So again, let's not limit, consign kelp forests to the aquatic system, but really understand all the ways in which they're connected. How am I doing for time? 1 minute. Wow. Okay. So we worked in 2021 to get legislative funding to support implementing the kelp plan with a bunch of partners who are listed here. We're going to work again with the legislature in 2023 so we can continue to get state support for getting traction on these important priorities identified in the kelp plan. We're working with the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation on a new Eyes on Kelp initiative, and we were totally inspired by the expedition we did in 2021, and we want to get more Eyes on Kelp. We want to do it regularly. We want to be doing underwater ecological surveys, so we're not just mapping the surface extent, we're showing and watching what kelp communities are doing underwater, all the species that they're supporting. We want to get not just human eyes, but also electronic eyes. So we're working with a group called Marauder Robotics to develop a monitoring platform that can help provide more real-time information that we can use so that we can be responsive, so that we can manage what's happening, detect what's happening, manage it more effectively. Happily, Micah Horwith did an incredible job of describing this project that we worked on north of the Hood Canal Bridge with our partner Joth Davis back there. He described the kelp farm investigation north of the Hood Canal Bridge, and I could not have done a better job, so thank you, Micah. I can rip right through there. But we're also working on another seaweed investigation that was also identified as a priority of the Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification, and that is to see whether intertidal shellfish farms might provide a place where we could collect seaweed that naturally collects on aquaculture gear and try to move that back through various pathways back up onto the watershed. How are we doing for time? I'm over. Okay? This is just really telling you more about those sea-land seaweed solutions and all the things that we think and that we're trying to identify for people in various capacities throughout our communities to work on kelp. And so thank you to each and every one of you, from whom I've learned so much. And now, is there time for questions? Okay. Okay, we got to go to Emily. Okay, I'm very happy to introduce the next speaker, Emily Buckner, who is working now at Puget Sound Restoration Fund on a whole bunch of projects, including the seaweed collection project that I told you about, and also Dungeness crab. She came to us from after getting her master's at UW School of Marine and Environmental Affairs and working as a fellow at Washington Sea Grant. Thank you, Emily. Thank you.
Meg, can we get presenter mode?
Yes. You should be just the next slide. So if you just advance.
It's not presenter mode, though.
Oh, that.
I can't believe Meg put me to go after Betsy, so she's a hard act to follow. And also I had late night tide work, so I definitely need my notes today.
Yeah.
So thank you for a moment.
Okay. Slideshow. Presenter. Where is it? Presenter view. Yes, right there. And click ahead.
Excellent. Okay, well, I definitely want to echo.
Speaking of echo,
Yeah.
if we move this all the way here, as far as it will go, and you talk over here,
That works
I
better.
think it helps with the ringing.
Okay. So I just want to echo, obviously, the excitement at being with a bunch of people in a room talking about seaweed and its cultivation. So again, my name's Emily Buckner. I'm a project manager at PSRF. I'm happy to chat with folks afterwards about our awesome seaweed projects that we have going on. But today, my role as a presenter is to kind of take a step back a bit from that deep dive that we did into water quality issues earlier, and kind of provide an overview of all the potential ecosystem effects of in-water seaweed farming. As well as I'm going to speak a bit more about the challenges of developing and managing a new industry in an environment where there's very limited local research and information. But before diving in, I do just want to acknowledge that a lot of the material I'm going to be speaking about today comes from a much larger project with this whole list of folks here that I worked on when I was at UW with NOAA. This paper has been in the works for a long time, is finally in review, and it'll definitely be shared with this whole community once, everything okay? Okay. And it'll be shared with this community as soon as it's available. So I'll be giving kind of it'll be coming all from here. So I'm going to start with the kind of fairly obvious context, which is what everyone's goal for this industry is. And that's to be economically viable, socially acceptable, and ecologically sustainable, if not even beneficial. And I want to recognize that there's a lot of work from a lot of different disciplines that will go into finding that kind of perfect point in the Venn diagram. And for my little bit today, I'm going to be focusing just on that kind of ecological benefits circle, what it might take for us to develop a beneficial farming industry just from an ecological lens. And I also want to note, most of the way me and my co-authors have been approaching this is really thinking about it from a commercial standpoint. So I'm going to use the term industry a fair amount. All right. Okay, so the driving question that I think all of us have, and I know Meg kind of spoke to, is what should be our approach to developing an ecologically sustainable industry in an environment where there's very limited local data or even research on the topic. So first is to look outside of our system and community to identify from the global literature and experts, many of who have been speaking today already, what all of the potential ecological impacts are. And then we can apply that to our local context and native species. So once we've done that, we can then use this best available information to inform initial rules and regulations of the industry, as well as identify research priorities and a monitoring and adaptive management framework for this industry. And as best farming practices are developed, monitoring and assessment can feed back into those initial identified impacts and modify as needed. So thus kind of creating this circle of learning and adapting. Let's see. So my mouse is lost here. So while this is definitely our roadmap for developing this industry, we are more or less kind of still at those beginning stages, right? We're talking about kind of mostly steps 1 and 2, diving into 3 a little bit. And so for the next little bit, I'm going to be mostly speaking about this kind of number 1, so identifying all the potential impacts. And so when I'm sharing the next couple slides, I want folks to hold in their minds this image of a function machine, if anyone remembers that from grade school math, with the idea being that we can identify potential ecological impacts as kind of the inputs into this research and adaptive management machine that will then kind of weigh those impacts, conduct research to assess the validation and the nuances of those impacts, adapt management, and kind of create farming practices which will ultimately yield best farming practices. And so the reason why I really want you all to kind of think, I want to set things up this way, is so you don't see all the potential impacts I'm going to list so much as kind of this pros, cons list, so much as this kind of unweighted and unscaled inputs that we then need to really grapple with as a community. So let's begin by exploring some potential impacts of farming under the umbrella of habitat. So we know that farm seaweed mimics natural seaweed habitat and can provide really similar benefits to native species. But what we don't really know is what is the effects of creating a really ephemeral habitat is, attracting species to only then have that habitat be removed. So that's kind of a big question mark that we need to think about. We also know that forage fish spawn on nearshore aquatic vegetation and could certainly be attracted to cultivated seaweed. So clearly that would be a concern if we have forage fish spawn being removed from the marine environment on a harvested crop. So I'm just going to pause again and just thinking about this framework. So you can kind of see how there's multiple sides of the same coin, right, when we're discussing impacts. And that's why I think it's helpful to think of them more as these inputs into our function machine of research and adaptive management, because we'll start to weigh them against each other, right? These aren't set in stone, these are all potential. Okay, so I'll move a little more quickly now through some other things, but one more slide on habitat. So just like how the crop itself mimics habitat, farm infrastructure, so moorings, ropes, et cetera, also provide habitat and refuge for particularly sessile organisms. However, they also, having ropes in the water and infrastructure poses a real threat to wildlife. So particularly large marine mammals, and it can range everything from disrupting their movement and migration patterns to entanglement risks. We also know that farm infrastructure could be a potential source of marine debris, which is also another source of potential entanglement hazards. So if we move on to consider potential water quality impacts, which was obviously just discussed in depth by some actual experts, not myself, we know that seaweed is really good at extracting nutrients, chemicals, and metals from surrounding water column, as well as absorbing carbon and stabilizing very localized pH, as was discussed there. So certainly very clear benefits, but as mentioned by others already, we have to think about the scale of a farm that it would take to actually really realize those benefits. On the flip side, there's the potential that absorption of all those nutrients, cultivated kelp could maybe be competing with native kelp. And so we also need to kind of consider that on the other hand. Again, scale, though, is going to be a big consideration when thinking about these kind of weighing these pros and cons. So just like seaweed absorbs a lot of carbon and nutrients, it also sheds a lot of carbon and nutrients via detritus, particulates, and dissolved organic material, which I know, as Betsy and Tom like to emphasize, serve as a really great nutrient subsidy to the food web. But on the flip side, there's always that potential that all of that nutrients and particulates could overload the system with material. And that might particularly be an issue if there's kind of poor water exchange and flushing through the farm. There's also some fairly compelling evidence that seaweed farms can influence the local hydrology, dampening wave energy and potentially even serving to protect shorelines from storm surges. But a lot more, I think, investigation needs to go into this. Anytime we have infrastructure in the water disrupting or changing the natural hydrology, we definitely need to have a critical eye to what that impact really is. So moving on to benthic impacts. So it's quite well documented that anchors and moorings can create habitat-forming reefs, though it's also well documented that those same anchors can disturb benthic vegetation, wildlife, and seafloor structures. And then there's also concern that for the submerged vegetation, that a really densely cultivated seaweed crop could shade out any vegetation below it. So finally, it's important to consider the harder to see impacts, such as cultivated kelp populating the environment with reproductive material and influencing wild seaweed genetic diversity, or spreading diseases to native kelp populations. However, it's also kind of important to acknowledge, especially at this step, how the lens that we view the world and kind of our end goals of cultivating seaweed will kind of impact how we're going to be weighing these things, right? So I think I'd be remiss in saying that for some, cultivation techniques may be seen as a restoration tool, either as a way to potentially enhance wild beds or assist in selecting more climate resilient strains. Both of those were kind of mentioned already today. So that all said, I obviously put a big asterisk here because this is an issue that's going to take a lot of kind of research and deep partnership with resource managers to kind of figure out this balance here. I know there's going to be a whole panel dedicated to this subject at the later today, so I'm going to definitely let the experts who've been thinking about this more deeply discuss this. But I figured I would be remiss if I didn't include this in the list of potential impacts. All right, so I want to now just return back to that framework that I introduced at the beginning, because I just walked through step one pretty quickly. But we walked through step one, which is identifying that kind of whole suite of potential impacts, both positives and negatives. And so then step two is to apply that to our local context and native species. And kind of taking those together and start to weigh which of these impacts maybe we're more concerned about, what should we emphasize more, with the idea that then when we're starting to prioritize research, we can figure out which areas we should kind of start with, right? So my co-authors and I and the folks who've given us a lot of input in this have identified kind of 4 major ecological concerns for this region, which we think should be kind of the first points of emphasis and kind of the areas where farming needs to be the most kind of conservative, right? And so number 1, nobody's surprise at all, is marine mammal entanglement. So first I want to note that there are no documented cases as of now of a marine mammal being entangled in a seaweed farm. But that said, any lines in the water pose a potential threat, and these are highly protected and, as everyone knows, very beloved animals in this region. So we definitely want to emphasize caution here and be super conservative. The second point that we would say is something to really emphasize is this issue of forage fish spawning events. So we would recognize that there's a pretty high likelihood that this could occur. Forage fish are a super important species or group of animals in our system. So we want to make sure we're not negatively impacting them in any way. Oh, let's see if there it is. Okay. The third is this question of benthic disturbance or shading of submerged aquatic vegetation, such as eelgrass. So again, kind of thinking about this region and how important eelgrass is as habitat for all sorts of organisms going forward. So again, we don't want to be negatively impacting eelgrass in any way. And then finally is this issue of influencing wild kelp genetic diversity. And the reason why we wanted to emphasize this so much is mostly because of the big question mark that it poses right now, but also based off of Betsy's talk just now, we know that wild kelp populations are struggling in our region, and so we want to be super thoughtful moving forward to think about how a seaweed farming industry would interact with wild kelp populations. So again, by emphasizing these 4 concerns out of kind of all the potential impacts I listed before, we can stipulate that initial farm design, research, and monitoring should really prioritize mitigating and understanding these risks first. All right, so finally, I want to kind of put all this together and show how that first step of identifying potential ecological impacts plus prioritizing local concerns can help develop initial farming practices, such as where to site a farm. And our paper goes into more depth with some other steps too, harvesting, cultivation, et cetera. But I'll just talk about siting a farm here. So first, you would want to ensure that water quality meets growth requirements for kelp and contaminants. You want to make sure you can grow kelp where you know kelp can grow. You want to make sure your kelp isn't going to be absorbing a ton of nasty stuff in the water that then people can't consume. You also want to ensure that there's adequate water flow through the farm. This is both to make sure your crop has sufficient nutrients for growth, but also so that that the particulates are being flushed from the system and not potentially overloading it. Though, as noted earlier by Micah, you want to make sure that it's not so much water flow that maybe you're not getting any of those potential benefits of mitigating pH and things like that. So out of concern for native vegetation, farms should minimize any overlap with native aquatic vegetation and could consider being sited in fairly moderate water depth so that it would be so deep it couldn't actually shade anything below it. though you wouldn't want it to be too deep, right? Because we want to avoid any marine mammal, we want to avoid marine mammal feeding areas and movement areas as much as possible. So, you know, avoiding siting your farm in an area with a history of forage fish spawning events, as well as known marine mammal feeding areas. I'm thinking of like where the sounders, the gray whales, return year after year after year, especially in the Whidbey Basin. All right, so that's kind of a whirlwind. I know that everyone wants to go on break anyway, so I sped through that. But I'm going to conclude here, and I'm looking forward to either discussion, probably at break, lunch, et cetera. I'm guessing we won't do questions now. But I do just kind of want to take one last second to kind of conclude and just acknowledge that folks at the end of this presentation especially might feel a little maybe unsatisfied, maybe a little frustrated, like there are a lot more questions than answers, like maybe there's not a lot of guidance, maybe that guidance is kind of vague, to be totally honest. And I just wanted to say that I totally understand that, and I feel very similarly often when thinking about these issues. Our paper does go in more depth, so I hope we can give you more information soon. But this also kind of, this is the place that we're in with this industry. We're really at the beginning, and just there's a lot of learning and adapting to be done. So, while people may be sitting with some frustrations, I also want to offer the counter perspective, which I try to tell myself when working on this stuff, which is how exciting is it? And Meg said this too, right? It's super cool to be at the beginning of this future industry and be able to guide and develop and direct it to make it the best it can be. So hopefully people can go out on break feeling really more energized and excited about all the opportunities moving forward. So I will just leave the acknowledgement slides up. So many people have contributed their thoughts, their feedback, their ideas to myself and my collaborators. So many of them in this room. So huge thank you, and I'm sorry this paper has been taking so long. Okay. Kate says a few questions are. A few minutes for questions. Okay. Okay. Right here. Okay. If people want to. Great. Yeah. Do you want to come up?
Maybe nobody has questions.
It might. They might be.
Don't feel that you must.
Hi, thanks. Great presentations. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question, and I love sort of this big picture, Betsy, that you're having us like help us envision sort of the bigger picture of kelp beyond structure. I think that's really important. I'm gonna get to a more wonky question, but I'm curious with your restoration research if you're focusing also on sort of the causes of decline in those areas and versus sort of propagation techniques, and if you can talk a little bit about the balance between your restoration research and how it addresses both of those factors?
Yeah, great question. Did everybody hear that? Okay, so the question is, in our restoration, are we also focusing on the causes of the disappearance of kelp forests in those areas or those declines? And it's a really, really good question. And I think that the way that we're pursuing this is that there always have to be parallel pathways, multiple pathways, in terms of trying to understand the drivers and the stressors of decline, as well as testing out whether or not it's possible to do restoration. I think that restoration itself as an action can also often provide really good research opportunities to give you information about conditions in that place. And are conditions such that you can grow a kelp forest from seafloor to sea surface? Are conditions such that you can also be supporting those earlier life stages such that you get natural recruitment? Where are the bottlenecks? Where are the things that aren't working? So it gives us insight into what's working and also can just potentially provide more propagules in the water, because if the decline and disappearance and sinking below a critical threshold of kelp forests as an area is the reason why there's not enough, it can't come back, there aren't enough propagules in the system, then that may be one of the limiting factors, one of the stressors. So it's giving us information, it's giving us a living laboratory in which to try to answer those questions.
None of them working? Okay. So I'm Phil Black with Confluence Environmental. My question is for Emily or comment somewhat. You highlighted, I think accurately some of the potential concerns. I think it's important to pass those through the analysis of best management practices, as you suggested with the siting as a clear way to avoid some of the impacts to SAB and eelgrass, in addition to just highlighting what the concerns are. Because some of those are fairly effectively managed with best management practices. Some of them may not be. And I just wanted to see what your thoughts are and if there are ways to incorporate that into your
Yeah, it's a great question. So that's the second part of our paper does dive into kind of these initial kind of guidance ideas for for farm design that will hopefully incorporate and minimize any of those potential impacts. So there's things that we can do like for forage fish spawn. It's pretty simple. If forage fish spawn on your kelp, you can't harvest it. There's a pretty simple best farming practice. You would work with Fish and Wildlife and kind of coordinate your harvest to be timed to make sure that there was no longer the eggs had hatched, et cetera. So there's some very kind of simple best management practices to mitigate some of these concerns, but others are really challenging. And I think that's where we get that kind of the struggle between a sustainable versus a beneficial industry. And so, we talked a lot about scale of farm. If we wanted to use seaweed cultivation as a way to try and help with eutrophication or mitigate OA, we would need absolutely massive farms to do that. At a large scale. And a massive farm is going to cause problems if we think about entanglement risks or marine spatial use conflicts. And so I think that's where the farm design is tricky, and we really want to emphasize that adaptive management because we're trying to kind of weigh the benefits and the concerns and try and meet in the middle the best we can. So you're right that there are some best farming practices that right off the bat we can just say right now, like the forage fish spawn, like harvesting your whole crop so that you don't allow reproductive material to enter the environment. So there's things we can say off the bat that we think will work, but there's going to be a lot of trial and error in trying to find that sweet spot. So thanks for your question.
Evidence surrounding, floating aquaculture, how animals may be attracted or avoid those areas, through the growing process of if you have a kelp farm where your biomass is increasing, how would animals be more likely or less likely to avoid those areas?
Before she answers, could you give us your name, please, for the recording?
Yeah, my name is Casey Pruitt, and I'm with the DNR Science.
Casey Pruitt, thank you. And I think this is the last question, right, Meg? Or is there room for one more after this? This is it? Casey, you got the last one.
You asked thanks for ending with a hard question. Yeah, I don't know if we're going to have, Dan, do we have any entanglement folks here from NOAA today to speak on that at all? Okay. So one thing in our paper that we recommend, we did talk with folks from PRD, Protected Resources Division, about recommendations for how to kind of hopefully most minimize an entanglement concern. Most entanglements that happen, especially on the West Coast, are with pot fisheries or loose nets. So usually the issue with entanglement is more really loose lines. For seaweed farming, it's already the practice, but we would emphasize that you'd want really, really taut lines in the water as a way to kind of hopefully not allow entanglement to occur. You can have, really intense, I'm thinking like metal lines even. I think your question about like the size of farm, attracting them, was that your kind of a side question?
Yeah, I guess an avoidance as well. You have material growing as, farms you're going from lines in the water to, biomass increasing. If there'd be any seasonal maybe avoidance, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think that would have to be researched. And I think in our, in our recommendations for monitoring, we think that, reporting and monitoring species assemblages around farms is really important, both to kind of get a better sense for how much are we mimicking habitat, creating habitat for forage fish, salmon, et cetera, but also any larger species like marine mammals. It would be really important to kind of note those patterns of interaction. Definitely if there was any actual bad interaction, that would be you'd have to report that. But we definitely would emphasize trying to start getting a sense for those interactions, because I think it's a really interesting question. And yeah, sorry, I don't know.
Thanks, Casey. Okay, so we're going to take a break now. Meg will give us info.
We are almost back on schedule, and thank you to fantastic speakers, Emily and Betsy, and wonderful questions from you all. We're going to have a 15-minute break. We're going to start the next session at 10:40, and I just want to say that for people who may be, no, I'm not going to say that. Go have a break, get some coffee, go to the bathroom, please come back and be ready to listen at 10:40. Thank you. All right. Is our moderator Betsy in the room? Betsy Peabody. Betsy. Here she comes. I'll just take this opportunity to say that the paper bag idea, it actually makes it really hard to, if questions go in there, it's hard to see them. So feel free to just put your questions on the floor next to the paper bag, and our runners will find those questions. And we are going to, the format of this panel is sort of one after the other. The panelists will each have about 5 minutes, I believe, to talk, and then Betsy will run the show, and there will be lots of time, I believe, for Q&A. One final thing, for anyone who may be watching this live stream, which we only just found out is live streaming. Yay. No, yesterday we knew. But if you are in TV land, the link I sent to you yesterday will only work through the end of, until noon, basically. To watch the afternoon, you need to go to masontv.com? Yes, Mason for Mason County, web for the web, tv.com. That's our videographer's channel, and you will see the afternoon presentation as an option on the thing. So I'll bring back our wonderful Betsy, and we have one remote speaker on this panel, and I may have to do something to welcome her into the room. I'm going to try that briefly. Come on, mouse. Oops. Where's the mouse? Oh, gosh. Has this happened already today? I'm sorry, my mouse has disappeared. I'm going to try that. Okay. Zoom.
Do you want me to talk while you do that?
Yes, please.
Okay. This is going to be fun. There is a lot to talk about here, and Meg has sort of done the Herculean heavy lifting here in terms of pulling this panel together, but also working with a steering committee for this conference who are here. Really appreciate all the effort, and also the effort to pull together this particular panel. So it's being called Seaweed Metaphysics, and really and that might seem a little bit obscure to you, but the reason for that is because we want to kind of get into the philosophical space a little bit. why people want to farm seaweeds. People come into this from varying perspectives. They're trying to get different things out of it. We're trying to put brackets around what is possible in seaweed farming in terms of the benefits, the multiple benefits we might want to take. So we want to venture around that metaphysical space a bit and get our panelists to share their perspectives, because they're all involved in seaweed farming from different perspectives. And there are lots of different ways to farm seaweeds. There are the in-water systems, there's the tank culture, there's putting line out in an intertidal setting, lots of different ways to do it, and therefore different benefits that might be associated with these different techniques. There was some really interesting discussion earlier this morning during the panel that Micah Horwith was on, really sort of, trying to put some realistic parameters around carbon benefits. Is this something that can provide a carbon strategy, a carbon dioxide removal strategy? And I would say that you will learn from these panelists that there are a whole lot of other reasons to farm kelp. Carbon might be among the things that they're hoping to do by reconnecting to kelp, growing kelp, but these are also people who want to connect to kelp, grow kelp, because they want to be producing and growing something versus just being consumers in society. They want to have a restorative effect, and that restorative effect might be defined in different ways. So they have really interesting stories to tell, and we're going to go in this order, okay? Joth, everybody's going to talk for 5 minutes. And Joth Davis with Blue Dot Sea Farm is going to be first. In-water system. And second is going to be Travis Bettinson. And he's with Blue Dot Kitchen, so he's actually taking the kelp that Joth is growing at the in-water system, and he is making kelp products out of it. So there's that part of the story. Then we're going to, is there something you want to say? No. Okay, then we're going to go to Diane Boriton, who is online, and she's doing tank culture. And she's been growing algae in tank culture for 20 years maybe, and she runs a company called Soul Sea, and she produces cosmetic products, beautiful kelp creams. And then we're going to go to Leanne Ennis, who is growing kelp, seeding kelp along the shore. And you heard earlier that one of the concerns about kelp farming might be that it negatively affects forage fish spawning. But you know what? She's taking a very different approach to that, and kelp can actually be a means to restore forage fish spawning habitat if you're growing it and leaving it out there for that very purpose. So lots of different ways to tackle this. And then finally, we're going to Tila Troge with the Shinnecock tribe from Long Island, who is reconnecting to kelp, growing kelp in a multi-generation sort of effort in some amazing ways. So I want them to share. And then finally, Meg Chadsey is going to anchor this panel, and she's going to bring us back to reality. So we're venturing into all of these wonderful reasons, and Meg is going to help us put some brackets around what we can hope to achieve, what benefits we hope we can achieve from kelp farming, because she's been sort of on the receiving end of a lot of this research, a lot of this scrutiny. So this is going to be really interesting for me to learn. And so hopefully we'll be able to handle the technical issues by bringing Diane Boriton in. Hopefully, Diane, you can hear us. Is there any way we can ascertain that? Terry King gives us a thumbs up.
I can absolutely hear you.
Okay, Diane, and we can hear you. That's fantastic. Okay, Mr. Joth Davis, take us to the in-water
All right. Well, I guess
kelp farm.
I get to launch us under the metaphysics of kelp. Little bit of background. I was 20 years lead researcher for Taylor Shellfish Company, got involved in a lot of different projects, and what Betsy probably doesn't even know is that we actually cultured a red algae as part of our work out there because we were developing a feed for pinto abalone at the time. I spent about 10 years plus as senior scientist with the Puget Sound Restoration Fund, and over 30 years ago, I founded Baywater Shellfish Company, and happily, my son Caleb is now the one out on the beach last night harvesting shellfish, so I can get some sleep and be here. I was part of the Washington State ocean acidification work group looking at adaptation, and that's where really we started thinking about phytoremediation, and that's the story. My story really in seaweed started then, because then working with Betsy and others, we addressed a challenge from the Paul Allen Foundation to consider whether growing seaweeds at scale could have any effect on local water quality relative really to dissolved CO2 and pH. And Micah did a great job this morning of summarizing that work. I wish it had been more definitive, but it was not. Luckily, in other places of the world, especially in Maine, and where Nicole has been working, has demonstrated halo effects, which is gratifying. And so I'm going to talk this afternoon a little bit about co-culturing shellfish and seaweed. So I'm not going to address that component right now. But as far as the bottom line is, from a planetary perspective, we're 8 billion people plus, and we need to address the food supply, food security, and that's going to include the ocean in ever increasingly ways. And so I get into seaweed because I feel that there's opportunities for utilizing seaweeds for food, and Travis is going to talk about that. There are also a myriad of uses, which I'm not going to get into because my 5 minutes is about over. But I'm going to, when it comes back around to the discussion, I'm going to really focus on where I feel we need research. I feel that's incredibly lacking in this part of the world, and we need to address these data gaps to ensure that we do seaweed culture both responsibly and sustainably. So I'll pass the mic. I think it's about right.
Yeah. Okay. So you're passing that down to Travis.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? All right. Thank you. Sometimes I just don't work with mics very well. Yeah, my name is Travis. I'll give you a few minutes on myself. Let me start my 5-minute timer here. Give you a few minutes on myself and then a few minutes on Blue Dot Kitchen. So my background has always been in food. I came from restaurants and culinary arts and culinary nutrition, where I got Johnson & Wales, a bachelor's in culinary nutrition. Worked in restaurants for a little under 10 years before I came out to Seattle and started a private chef catering service. I ran that for a while until I wanted to improve my story that I was telling and do more for the food system. I was using wonderful produce from great local farms, but I was using 50 pounds a week. And I wanted to have more impact. I've always also been an environmentalist. So I went to Washington State University, food science and management, with the intention of scaling up what I could do for the food system. While I was doing that, I fell into some R&D in various different startups and projects, and I fell in love with that. And during that R&D time, I fell in love with kelp. We all know the story of kelp from a food systems perspective. It is incredibly powerful. And that's when I started with my partners, Blue Dot Kitchen. Blue Dot Kitchen, what we're doing is we're taking sea greens and we're making them into deliciously irresistible organic snacks, helping to cleanse the ocean and helping to improve the food system at the same time through the consumption of those. So we launched our first product 8 months ago. We're working with any Washington farm that comes up for sure, and other partner farms as well, as long as it's organic kelp. We were drying it, powderizing it on Washington dehydrators in eastern Washington, mixing it with sorghum and popping it into these crispy, crunchy seaweed snacks. We've been out for around 8 months, seen some really good success in around 50 plus retail outlets, including Climate Pledge Arena, where we're at the concessions there, being served during NHL games, and at Lumen Field, where we're being served during NFL and MLS games. And at the MLS games, we're the second best selling item at the concession that we're at, one below nachos, one above mac and cheese. No surprise there, right? So really what we're trying to do is develop that marketplace for farmers so that when there are farms popping up, there's a market for them to sell into by making this nutritious product that has incredible environmental profile impactful in the food system. So that's what we're doing at Blue Dot Kitchen. That's what our laser focus is on, is food CPG, but also in the process technology. Give me 1 second, my phone just went blank on me. I need to know how much time I have left.
You're good.
And I'm happy to talk, oh yeah, I got plenty of time. So process technology as well. The story behind that is, you know, seaweed is still a new industry in the United States. It has incredible opportunity to be a staple crop of the US. Something that hasn't happened in the US for hundreds of years. Staple crops do not come and go. And this really does have the opportunity to be a staple crop of the US food system. And to do that, there needs to be processing infrastructure. And I don't mean the machines to dry it and powderize it, or the larger manufacturing systems to turn it into whatever products you're making, but the processes that they will utilize that are specific to seaweed. We saw early on with our work with industrial dehydration that fruit dehydrators are not set up for seaweed dehydration. It's different systems. And that's another thing that we're tackling outside of our food CPG focus is processing technology, so that when there are farmers up who need markets and we have products to sell, that the middle also has process that's in place to make sure that the whole food chain system can add value to this product for the customer at the end. I'll stop there and happy to talk more about this as we go, of course, with an extra minute to spare.
Thank you, Travis. Okay, so our next speaker is actually Diane Borotin, who is online. Diane. And Diane, as I mentioned before, she grows seaweed in a tank culture setting. So Diane, yes?
I just want to make...
Meg's going to help make this happen. Diane, I'm going to be watching the clock, and hopefully you've got a little clock there. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes, Diane, for you to tell us your wonderful story.
Hi, Diane. And Diane, as I mentioned before, she grows seaweed in a tank.
Weird. Okay.
So Diane, yes? Meg's going to help make this happen. Diane, I'm going to be watching the clock, and hopefully you've got a little clock there. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes, Diane, for you to tell us.
Maybe.
That's going to be pretty hard, as you know.
We need to be muted. She grows seaweed in a tank.
Diane, just give us a second. We're trying to figure out some technical difficulties.
Yes. Okay. Diane, you need to turn off the live feed for this.
I got it off.
Good. Okay. You can go.
Okay, all yours, Diane.
Oh, all right. I thought you were going to be where Meg is standing at the microphone. Anyway, my name is Diane, obviously, and I want to say good morning to all the interested parties and the seaweed fans there. I come from a long background in oceans and fisheries, and I started my career in Washington, D.C. at NOAA, heading national products like the Year of the Ocean, national seafood marketing campaigns, and working with fish in areas of omega-3 fatty acids in relationship to heart disease. So in the late 90s, after I had moved here working on some consulting projects in fisheries, I made a discovery in seaweed, and I ended up developing it into a product and patenting it in skincare. So the product came before the farm. So I had to go back now and look at, like, oh my goodness, how am I going to get consistent supply? You all know about supply chains and the issues we've had. Well, the same thing in a micro sense. When you're building a seaweed company, you need to have consistent supply that's going to provide you a product base for your product line. And so it's illegal to harvest seaweed commercially in Washington State and in the coastal waters. So, this entered a huge, new problem. So I ended up with working with the University of Washington, the wonderful Bob Walland, and his work earlier with Tom Mumford on tank farming. And I raised the capital. We put in about $500,000, and I organized a site at Manchester at the NOAA facility, because they were very interested in innovative research and development of new products and what we could do with seaweed. So we ended up having a couple of years of growth. We started in 2000, and we designed tank systems that were technologically perfect for our facility. We have a dual pass system. We started with fish feed, fish water coming in, provided us a lot of nutrients to grow the seaweeds. This is the product line, See Me. And so there's something at the, there's products at the end of the tunnel for seaweed, if you want to go into that area. We needed a consistent supply of raw materials, so that was really important to bring everything together. So this led to work with, in basically, this is called an intensive culturing operation. And we call it intensive because we now can produce about 28 metric tons in our tank farm in 24 commercial tanks on less than 1/8 of an acre. So it's intense because it's a lot of seaweed in a small space using very minimal amounts of energy to produce. And I think that's important in today's world to do that. We also in the early days picked up all the nitrates and ammonium in fish, which made our seaweed flourish. In 2014, we directed our attention to growing a number of seaweeds while measuring capacity for production. And I think this is important because then it could provide us an economic model and a base for developing a business. And so this is really important. And it was also important that we found out early on that we oxygenate water going back to Puget Sound. And actually our water quality was better coming out of this marvelous, seaweed back to Puget Sound than the water coming in. All of our plants are regenerative. So now we're focusing on things like dulse and chondrochanthus. You can see, I think in that picture, we have the chondrochanthus on the left with Petro, and the ulva we were doing at that time, and then we have the dulse on the two right red plants. We have several different phenotypes that we've developed. Again, all of our plants are regenerative, so we don't go out and then put plants back in. We don't retransform everything. So it's really important to be able to do that because you want to know what you have for supply on a consistent basis. We also, the ulva we don't grow anymore because it's really a competitor to other plants and can suck up a lot of nutrients that we don't want it to. And we also did in the last few years interesting operation with Andy from PSI with co-culturing with sea cucumbers actually in our tanks. So you have a multi-level crop to produce. Everything we're producing, we're interested in producing within 6 months so that the seaweed comes off and you can harvest it every single month. And then you can do in most months out of the year, we're talking about 10 months. And this is a large extension to the growing season that you have with plants from the wild, especially on the kelps. During COVID, I have focused on developing sugar kelp and bull kelp operations. We also could do bladder wrack, and in the future, we're looking at a lot of these for incubation purposes. So we're going to look at some other seaweeds that may be available for commercial development. It's exciting because there's a lot of new, turning seaweed into profit is a good thing. New seaweeds markets that I've engaged in just the last couple of years are fish food. NOAA, we just completed work with NOAA, and fish food it's very exciting for incorporating seaweeds, our seaweeds, and with JOTH into the sea pellets that they're doing. And they had very great success with that. You can always check with Ron over at NOAA on that. We are also looking at farm food pelleting for pigs and possibly cattle. We've worked on new specialty foods, and we always are engaged in research. Research, like John said, is just ongoing. We've published a very comprehensive report, and I'll make that available to Meg as a link when she publishes the complete symposium in January. So what is our future? Right now, I'm looking at a ecologically based multi-trophic system that will incorporate our years of research with NOAA and all the other key organizations. And we look forward to our future work with our Washington partners on a continuing base, incorporating possibilities for co-culturing, large systems, and bringing in technology so seaweed can have full optimization on land. Our goal is more, better, faster. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Diane. Appreciate that. Okay, now we're going to move to Leanne Ennis.
Yeah, hi.
On Vancouver Island.
No, not quite. Sunshine Coast.
Sunshine Coast.
Yeah,
Excuse
British
me.
Columbia. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Betsy. Diane, that was excellent overview of your work. Thank you. What a pleasure it is to be here. Thank Meg for inviting me, and it's always nice to acknowledge the Nisqually and Squaxin Island territory that we're on, so I feel very welcome here today and amongst friends, and made lots of nice friends participating in this symposium. I'm from British Columbia. I live on the Sunshine Coast. I did take a ferry to get off the Sunshine Coast, even though it's not an island. I drove through Vancouver and down the I-5 yesterday. So I'm across from Vancouver Island, and I have been cultivating kelp for fish habitat and restoration and now research for the last 5 years. I got into this 5 years ago with an oyster farmer who had an existing aquaculture lease tenure, and he wanted to use his tenure to a better use because he was getting older and the oyster farming was hard on his body. So we got together and we got into kelp cultivating. And like my buddy Ted, who I hope will view this symposium later, I remember days when kelp was plentiful. I grew up on the north coast in a little village, Kitimat, in Haisla territory. I did a lot of boating with my dad, and I remember there were passes of water that we couldn't get through. We had to turn the engine off because the kelp was so thick and sort of wade our way through passes. I later settled on the Sunshine Coast, raising my family in Seashell territory. And there's a tidal rapids there called the Skookumchuck, or Seashell Rapids. It's quite a phenomenon where we have rapids of 14, 16, 17 knots, incredible movement of water in and out of Seashell Inlet. And we're also located in some of the hottest water in the Salish Sea. So we're in a real hot spot. If you've heard of Desolation Sound, that's just up the coast from where I'm at. And the water temperatures are upwards to 2 degrees warmer than elsewhere in the Salish Sea, and that's a real problem for kelp. So I wanted to use the kelp farming practice for kelp restoration. Betsy kind of hit on that it's the same needle, threading the same needle. So I had questions of how to bring the kelp back. I had observed the kelp decline in my area, and I knew when I stopped seeing kelp, I stopped seeing salmon. And I would rather have both salmon and kelp and rockfish and all the other animals that are intertwined in that food web back and have it, healthy. So I took upon this practice of creating a kelp nursery and learning cultivation techniques, and I'm here to tell you that it is so much fun to cultivate kelps and put back kelp in the water. So I do really see there's lots of overlap between kelp farming, research and restoration. There's so many overlapping benefits to it. Also working with tribal members or First Nations to integrate traditional ecological knowledge. So the people who are living out in these remote places have the most recollection of what it was like before, and to try to return to some of those baselines of what was where and how it functioned years ago. We need to tap into that knowledge. So I encourage everybody to work together to the benefit of restoring the habitat and having a flourishing farm, if you may, or whatever your interest is in cultivating. When I put kelp in the water every season, to my delight, the forage fish come back and spawn on it. I have tube snouts that lay packages of eggs every February, March. And Emily hit on the concern about forage fish, and we don't want to harvest those out of the water. But really what I've noticed is that they lay their eggs early and that it passes. They go through their incubation period on the kelp lines in amongst the holdfasts, and then they're gone. So you're providing a kelp nursery for those fish, and that's a wonderful thing. And it doesn't, I don't believe, impact the quality of the kelp, but I haven't had a herring spawn yet on the kelp. I know up in Alaska, Seagrove have had that experience. So the fish use the habitat early on, and hopefully the juvenile salmonids that are out migrating from the river systems and estuaries are also using the habitat. And let's see, I've also practiced a little bit of like spore bag placements. I thin my lines in the spring. I have Nereocystis saccharina and Alaria growing. With the Nereo, I pull it off the line in the spring, thinning it, and I've attached it to fist-sized rocks, and I've been able to plant out a mini kelp forest in an area that I know there's fewer urchins here than there. And so I've watched that kelp grow to maturity and produce source material. I've even cultivated the F2 off of that cultivated kelp. But I'll give a caution to preserving the genetic diversity of the area. Really important if you're going to get into cultivating that you practice knowing exactly where you're cultivating and that you're planting out in those locations to preserve the adapted kelp site specificity. What else can I say? Maybe nursery cultivation might not be for everybody, but I encourage maybe collaborating with each other and having a kelp hub where somebody might be doing the cultivating that's feeding the farms, and also that you have a component of research always on your farm where you can go back and do monitoring and learn as much as you can from the lines you have in the water. So there's lots of growth studies that could be done, or fecundity, these questions of recruitment that Betsy is hitting on. How much do we need to put back in the water to see a self-sustaining population the next year? So these are things I think of too, and just really exciting to practice cultivating kelp and to see the benefits of fish using it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And before we jump to you, Tila, just so that we have a good visual, are you growing this intertidally or subtidally in a suspension system? And also, I think you said that you're leaving your kelp in the water.
Yes,
you're
I am.
not harvesting any of it. So just give us a little more.
Sure. So I'm using old fish farm infrastructure.
Okay.
So these are docks and floats that were let go, literally let go by fish farms that were going to end up on the beach, that we collected up years ago And that is our infrastructure. So we have square pens, round pens. I have lines, 100-foot or 200-foot lines that go between pens. I have also done anchoring in the subtitle like you have. I used the entire footprint of the farm, so a couple hectares, and tried to maximize it. I've done vertical lines. The ones that I pull off thinning the lines and place on rocks and place out at 100 at a time, instantly used by fish, instantly. Like rockfish will show up right now, and they're so happy to use it. So I've tried just about everything.
Super.
There we go.
Thank you. Okay, so
Sheila.
now we're going to go, okay. I just did it.
No, I did it, but
Oh.
you can think that you did it.
I feel good. Okay, so we're going from the West Coast to the East Coast to Long Island Sound. So Tila Troge, tell us your story.
Good morning. My name is Tila. I am an enrolled citizen of the Shinnecock Nation. We are a first contact tribe. Prior to colonization, we had an extensive population that we supported with agriculture based on corn, beans, and squash, as well as a robust shell fishing and other types of fish, marine-based diet. Post-colonization, we encountered European settlers who were very cold and very hungry. And so we shared our knowledge of seaweed with them as a method to insulate their homes and as a biostimulant to add to corn, which they use to survive the cold northeast winter. And so we have a recorded history of seaweed that is quite robust. We're what's known as a recently federally recognized tribe. We got our federal acknowledgement in 2010 after a 32-year-long federal acknowledgement process. And as part of that process, not only did we have to prove that we were indigenous to the land, but we had to prove that other jurisdictions recognized our sovereignty over the land and the water. And so one of the ways that we did that was we used our documented reserved rights to seaweed, and not only seaweed as a natural resource, the seaweed that washes ashore, but also our history of using seaweed lots or seaweed farms, which we would lease out to non-Indians as a source of revenue for our tribal nation. And just to give you an idea of the regulatory landscape in New York as it regards to seaweed, it is not friendly. There are not too many people who are engaged in aquaculture who are able to enter the industry. That's changed this year. Our new Governor Hochul signed some legislation that's extremely limited in geographic scope, which opens commercialization to two bodies of water, the Peconic Bay and Gardner's Bay. But it's quite limited, and it's only sugar kelp. It's no other types of seaweed, which is interesting, and we're looking at expanding that. But where I really started, besides I'm an attorney, and so I know a lot about asserting our sovereignty through using these seaweed cases. But I was talking to a lot of producers of wampum, and so wampum is a bead that we produce traditionally. It's made from a clam shell. It's quite beautiful. It's a white and purple shell. It was used in the United States as the first currency traded on Wall Street. We didn't use it for currency, but the European settlers did. We used it to exchange ideas and beliefs and relationships. You've probably heard of wampum belts as they relate to the Iroquois tribe. And so we started hearing from our wampum producers that there was a problem with the wampum shells. They were becoming too brittle to make into the beads that we use as our cultural legacy and our way to exchange our customs and beliefs and relationships and trade with one another. And so, you know, we were seeking ways to solve this. And so we found that the problem was ocean acidification and excess carbon from greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. In addition to that, we have a horrible problem with nitrates. There are excess nitrates. We're surrounded by billionaires and millionaires. You've heard of the Hamptons. They surround our tribal territory. And since colonization in 1640, they have never built a wastewater treatment center. They do not have sewers. Every single home has very ancient septic systems which dump nitrates into the water at such a high level that earlier this year, the Biden-Harris administration declared the waters around our territory a national fisheries disaster zone because 99.99% of the shellfish died. And so that becomes a problem because we have been able to sustain ourselves since time immemorial for at least 13,000 years based on the abundance of the marine life that surrounded us. We can't depend on agriculture anymore. There was a company, Union Carbide, who polluted our land and our aquifers so badly with chemicals that we don't even engage in agriculture anymore because so many people have died of cancer. And so we depend on the sea for food, and we can't do that anymore. I have an 8-month-old son, and I think of him and his children and their children, and I think of ways that I can help the water, protect the water so that he can engage in his reserved fishing rights for generations to come. And so our answer was seaweed farming. So we farm sugar kelp. We have 3 farms. We have a hatchery. But more than that, we're working on developing a learning center for other indigenous groups from across the country to come and see what we're doing because we can't do it alone. We're 6 women. We're intergenerational. We have elders who advise us on what used to be the extensive amount of species that used to be in the water and help us in our journey towards restoration. And we've only been doing this a couple of years, but while we set out to address ocean acidification, we saw incredible observable elements of drastically improved biodiversity within our first season. We saw scallops, we saw oysters, clams, sharks, seahorses, horseshoe crabs, shorebirds that hadn't been seen in the area for at least 20 years flock to our farm. And so I just want to caution that we shouldn't get lost in the trees for sight of the forest because it's not just about sequestering carbon. It's not just about removing excess nitrates. Like there are so many possibilities that seaweed has. The production of corn in America, you know, when we go back to the history of that, it was based on seaweed being a biostimulant that allowed us to have a corn-based agriculture system that sustained a huge population prior to even colonization. And that's very true now when you look at talking about algae in relation to animal feed. Well, 95% of livestock feed is based on corn, and if you want to grow corn fast, add some seaweed there. It's a biostimulant. You'll have a very fast production. But I really think that what is critical is combining traditional ecological knowledge with scientific knowledge. I think that's where you'll see leaps and bounds in advancement of the industry. I don't think that you can move forward just looking at it with a scientific lens. You really need to, you know, be engaged with the indigenous people of the region. You know, I'm an attorney, I'm not a scientist, but there's incredible impacts in the scientific literature on the, you know, increase in biodiversity when you return stewardship of lands and waters to indigenous people. So it's a very critical component of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Tila. Thank you. And just so that we can dwell in that space just a couple minutes longer before we come back to Earth. So Tila, have you been able to harvest a product or develop a product? Can you just sort of like continue your story a little bit?
Sure. So we had our first harvest last season. We're developing a soil amendment. Traditionally, we would combine seaweed with fish to produce a true fertilizer. Seaweed on its own is more of a soil amendment. We did, I should note, have a much smaller yield than we had originally anticipated. Last season was our first full hatchery season, and we were incredibly successful, while our partners and other experts in our region had catastrophic failures in their hatchery. We blew everyone out of the water because we were so successful. And we attribute that we developed something called a Kind Words program, and we would actually sing to our kelp seedlings in the hatchery in our Algonquin language. We read them Joy Harjo's poetry. We had our children come in and practice saying nice things to the kelp seedlings. And, we really saw visible acceleration in their growth. And we didn't have anything scientifically to measure that, except for the catastrophic failures in the other hatcheries who did not have that. This season we have 3 different farm sites, and we're hoping to have a much bigger yield. And we're surrounded by golf courses and colleges and the estates of billionaires who artificially keep their lawns green, even though pre-COVID they were only there 2 months a year. And so we're hoping to reduce some of the nitrogen runoff that's occurring by replacing chemical fertilizers with a kelp-based, a sugar. Well, it's really, we also have elements of wild harvest. We have a lot of rockweeds, sea lettuce that we also add to our sugar kelp that we're farming to produce our soil amendment.
Thank you, Tila. Okay, do we need you to pass that microphone back to? Okay, or Meg's going to stand here? Okay.
Can I just say that I would rather just leave us all in Tila's space. I'm regretful that I need to talk right now.
You know what? We need to hear what you have to say.
Oh, I guess I could stand. Okay. I'll keep it under 5 so that we can get back to. And Tila touched on so many of the things that I would mention also, but in a slightly different framework. She has these wonderful stories. I have an infographic. I know which one I prefer. This infographic is meant to represent a very, popular is not the right word, but an idea that is certainly getting a lot of attention and traction, which is we're in a carbon fix on this planet right now. We have blown past the point where simply getting our emissions under control can prevent the worst consequences of climate change. And it is necessary to also figure out, this is what we're told, to pull carbon out of the systems where we've been putting it for over 150 years. And seaweed is one of the more popular ideas in that bucket. Should I stop? Should I say that I'm Meg Chadsey and my pronouns are she, her, and I work for Washington Sea Grant? And there's a little joke up there. I started at Washington Sea Grant about 11 years ago now as their ocean acidification specialist. But now I think I've officially crossed the threshold. I've been spending more time working on seaweed as their ocean acidification specialist than I have not. And so I am coming out of the closet right here, right now. I am now a carbon specialist. And I'll officially change that when I get back to work. Okay, so segue. So anyway, this idea of cultivating seaweed specifically to capture carbon, which it does while it's, you know, a solid biomass, while it's something that you can harvest. That is captured carbon. But in order to sequester, to put that carbon away, people have phrased it many different ways already today, you can't just leave it in the environment. You do have to put it somewhere where it will not decompose like your leaf pile or grass pile in the backyard and go directly back into carbon dioxide, because that is what it naturally is meant to do. It's meant to cycle the carbon in the environment. If we're going to use seaweed to capture and sequester carbon, we need to pull it out of the marine environment. And we would have to do this on a truly mind-boggling, massive scale. I'm not good with zeros after we get past 9 or 12. I can just say that the target is pulling 10 gigatons of carbon out of the atmosphere and oceans every year for the foreseeable future, starting as soon as we possibly can. 10 gigatons of carbon is just a lot. It would represent intensive farming of a large patch of the ocean. So I'm skeptical. I'm very skeptical that this is possible. I'm concerned about the environmental and social ramifications of practicing anything like that on such a scale. And the only thing that sort of matches my concern and skepticism about this potential tool to capture carbon is my concern and sometimes pessimism about what we're doing in the meanwhile. We really do have a carbon problem and we really do need to fix it. So I try to balance that every day. And I'll just say, so to wrap up, many people, since I've become the seaweed hot speed dial at Washington Sea Grant, come to me and say, I just heard about seaweed farming. It sounds wonderful. It's beautiful. It seems like a great way to be a regenerative farmer. I want to get into it. And I want to sequester carbon. And usually these are people who are thinking about small-scale farms like the one that Joth operates. And so I cringe sometimes when I hear people say, I'm going to be a kelp farmer, or I am a kelp farmer, and kelp sequesters carbon. The sorts of farming we're talking about that will likely happen in Puget Sound are not going to meaningfully draw down carbon and solve that problem. But they can do, as you've already heard, kelp cultivation for variety purposes can do so many other good things, like Tila was describing, that we can emphasize those, and I would like to have people, at least until the research catches up with the aspirations around carbon capture and sequestration, I'd like to have people sort of step back from claims about carbon capture and sequestration, but embrace all the other things that kelp can do. And if there's things you wanted me to say that I haven't yet, you can ask me about them, because I want to turn everything back over. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panelists. And, oh, thank you. You know, so we're at this very interesting point in time, and we've got this big, beautiful kelp space, lots of different reasons to cultivate kelp for many co-benefits, but we're also trying to solve a carbon problem. We're also trying to find natural climate strategies, mitigation strategies, et cetera. So this big, beautiful thing is being reduced down into this quantified space in order to determine whether or not this can provide meaningful, quantifiable carbon solutions. So we're going to have to do that as we explore blue carbon options reasons. We're going to have to enter that space. At the same time, I hope that it never limits the flourishing of these other reasons for cultivating kelp. So that's a bit of our conundrum. So we're going to open this up for questions and answers. I hope that the panelists themselves can ask questions of each other and kind of drill into what others might be doing in order to open up and grow their own operations. I see this gathering is called a Seaweed Knowledge Symposium. There is a lot of knowledge in the audience as well. So if questions are answered and panelists might have, or questions are asked, panelists might have an answer to some of those questions, but there may be people in the audience who have interesting answers to those questions. So I want to just sort of break down this wall between panelists and audience as well, okay, so that we can share information. Okay, so there are some questions, initial questions that have come to the fore. And one is from Dominic Kastner. This is a question for Travis. Does blanching seaweed extend the shelf life? That's the first part of the question. The second part is, could blanched seaweed be vacuum sealed and sold on grocery store shelves? So our food scientist hopefully can answer those questions. Travis.
Dominic, where are you? Hey, nice to meet you, Dominic. So blanching it doesn't necessarily extend the shelf life very long. The shelf life of seaweed is short due to its water content, essentially. You actually are removing a lot of the salt from it when you're blanching it, which is a preservative. Naturally, it's about 3% salt. So it wouldn't extend the shelf life necessarily. Vacuum sealing could do that. In theory, yes, you can blanch, vacuum seal it, and get it onto retail shelves. The biggest challenges is because what we're doing at Blue Dot Kitchen is thinking at scale is, A, how do you develop a market for that? You know, for people who aren't already bought into eating kelp, who aren't already bought into eating seaweed, it's a challenging product to use. And also the retail CPG space, consumer packaged goods space and foods is also challenging. You know, it's not just going to your local store and dropping it off. If you want to make a difference, there's lots of channels you have to work. So possible, yes. If I could extend the question a little bit, would I suggest that as a avenue? I don't know. It depends on what you want to do with it. If you're planning a small farm and you just want to make sure you can have your products that gets moved in a way that you're appreciating it and taking care of it and want to control that part, it's possible. But I don't see it as a viable long-term option in the US for years and years and years. I think the market needs to be developed, and what we're doing with Cicerones is getting it into people's ideas with a crispier, crunchier snack that's more of a US texture of customers who like that kind of snack that, yeah, kelp that's grown regeneratively in US waters is something I eat. I tell the story often of when I go back to see my best friend on the East Coast, and I was at his wedding and was talking to his father who had just retired, and he said, you know, I just retired and my wife wants me to eat healthier. So I stopped eating potato chips and I tried these seaweed snacks. But I just didn't like the flavor. I couldn't do it. It wasn't for me. And it was just this signal in my head that said, I mean, even older generations are on board with eating seaweed because of the story, because of the nutritional profile. It's just not taste and texture for them. So that's what we're trying to do, is expand the amount of people who are eating it so that 5, 10 years down the road, people already have it in their head, yeah, I eat kelp. And it's a lot easier for them to pick it up off the shelves in a vacuum-sealed frozen state. So sorry for the tangents, but I think it all ties around to that question.
That's great, thank you. So a question from Jackie Dexter. As a commercial operation, would leaving grow lines fallow, like in land-based systems, would this be a successful form of restoration? So in other words, never harvest them. You're leaving those cultivation lines fallow. So which of you would like to answer that? Maybe Leanne and then Joff?
Sure, I can tackle that one. Well, it turns out actually that we remove the grow lines once they've been harvested. But having said that, the infrastructure at Hood Head and North Hood Canal consists of a lot of other material in the water, kelp material in the water, because it's there's a natural recruitment of sugar kelp and some bull kelp on the system. So that is left, and that is typically left for full grow out, and it will slough off over time. So no on the grow lines because we want to get them out of the water, but yes on the rest of the infrastructure.
Jackie, I leave my lines in the water as long as I can. And there's something that happens in April, May, bryozoans arrive. You get this natural set of bryozoans, and if you're commercially going to harvest, you need to get those out of the water before the bryozoans set on your product. I don't mind because I'm not harvesting for food, so I let that happen. I have played with dropping the lines though, because I've got short lines in a intensive area, so I can drop the lines. I played with that when I see one bryozoan, drop the lines. And I've managed to pass by the set of bryozoans by doing that. But I've also left them at a depth that they've been covered with bryozoans to the point where you would not harvest that for food at all. Unfortunately, it's ruined. I don't mind. And what I see is the kelp outgrows the bryozoan over time. So after a few weeks, because the incredible growth on the fronds, it's sloughing off the ends, and behind it is new growth. So it's possible you can still salvage the new growth if you can manage that. But really, the bryozoans kind of cramp your style for food harvest. What else can I say? I leave them in into July. And then eventually you need to get your lines out of the water and clean them.
Mm-hmm.
But the fish use is often in the early spring.
Great. Thank you, Joth and Leanne. Okay, so the next question is a big question, and you guys can decide among you who's going to take it. And if you decide not to take it, maybe there's somebody in the audience who wants to take it, okay? There are tools and processes for farmers, and I think what's meant here is land-based farmers, to claim carbon credits for their crops, i.e. corn, soy, etc. What does it take to get to a point where kelp farmers can also get carbon credits for their crops? And this is a question from Tuan Lei. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. Great. Okay. So, okay.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Well, I think as we're learning, a typical sugar, let's just use sugar kelp as an example. It's about 91% water, and of that remainder, okay, you've got a dry product. About 20% of that is carbon, and about 2% of that dry material is nitrogen. So it comes right back around to what we're all, I hope, getting our heads around is scale. Okay, there's the scale of what kelp can do from a carbon capture perspective is very, very difficult to envision. And so I know there are schemes out there that envision growing kelp at very large scale. When I started this journey, I think I remember very distinctly talking to Betsy about, if this is going to mean anything, it means really growing kelp on the scale of corn in Iowa, in Nebraska. I mean, that's the kind of scale that is meaningful. And I will say this, that everything we talk about today with respect to carbon capture, it's all really predicated on the absolute necessity, and if there's any take-home message today, it's the absolute necessity to keep carbon in the ground. Okay, that's the ultimate, that's where we need to go. Everything else is window dressing. We have to keep carbon in the ground. And so how we do that as policies, it's something that I think about every day. We can't afford to be drilling. And so all the talk about kelp and biosequestration and carbon capture, it's window dressing. because ultimately we need to keep carbon in the ground. So that's what I'm going to say.
Great segue, because I have the good fortune of working closely with just amazing oceanographers at the NOAA labs, the Pacific Marine Environmental Lab in Seattle. Probably the best team of carbon measurers in the US, and they are, it's interesting to see how they're sort of, the way they talk about this has changed in the 10 or 11 years since I've known them. As I said, when I talked that we've blown past this point, many people feel, where we can step back from, some serious consequences simply by keeping things in the ground. We are now at a point where we have to do both at the same time, and that is a message I hear these NOAA scientists say whenever they have an opportunity. We have to do both. But the idea that you can develop ways of capturing carbon and sequestering them, and there are many other potential pathways besides growing seaweed and hiding it away somewhere, should never overshadow the absolute, first, always, all the time, need to be reducing, to getting off of carbon, getting to be a carbon-free global economy. So that, and people are very concerned that if we pay too much attention to these Band-Aid, not Band-Aid, but we'll fix it after it's out, the horse is out of the barn strategies, then we won't pay attention to keeping the horses in the barn. So there's that. But you, Tuan, you asked what is needed, and I'm really glad you asked that question. What is needed to have a carbon credit, a marine carbon credit market? Because that is another thing that people who are interested in getting into seaweed farming ask me a lot is, who will pay me? Where, when can I sell, where do I sell my carbon credits? And I have to break the news that there is a landmark. Nicole, do we need to do something?
No, we're good.
Okay. There is a verified market for terrestrial carbon. We've been farming on land in the sort of, I'll just say that's more developed than marine. And what is required to have a carbon market is a way of monitoring, measuring, reporting, and validation. There's an acronym for that, MMRV. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Energy, they're all over that for things like corn growing and better terrestrial farming practices. But we're not there yet in the marine environment. These things are so hard to measure. Mike had described earlier today trying to detect a fairly subtle change in the levels of carbon as water flowed through a kelp farm. At one point, at one level, carbon's coming out of the water because you can see it turning into kelp. But measuring that and monitoring the changes and verifying it, very hard to do. And you have to do that in order to have a carbon currency, I'll just call it. Otherwise, you don't know the value of your carbon currency. And so what has to literally happen is we have to develop those technologies, protocols. We have to make them more accessible and less expensive and more widespread than they are right now. We have to have international agreements about what it means to sequester carbon, what's the value of carbon captured in kelp as opposed to cultivated kelp as opposed to carbon that exists in a wild kelp bed that we might be preserving and protecting versus carbon that a rockfish eats and then swims. Rockfish live a very useful length of time in terms of carbon sequestration. Rockfish get older than we do. And so if kelp carbon finds its way into rockfish and they are, actually 50% kelp carbon, does that count? Should it count? These are questions that people need to answer. And they're really great questions. I'm going to go off on a tangent here, so I'll just hand the mic back to Jonathan in just a second. But yeah, we're not there yet. So please, you will hear people talk, especially reading in the popular literature, as if marine carbon markets are already a thing. They are not. There are things called voluntary markets. There are companies that I won't name that will you can pay them, and they will say, it's okay, we're sequestering carbon. Nobody's checking up on them. It's not verified. So be skeptical. Okay, Jonathan.
Thanks, Meg. A couple things. The sequestering or the uptake of carbon by kelp is actually easy to measure. It's just not very much. And that, again, comes back to scale, right? So, and I know there's a lot of interest worldwide on sequestration. In fact, I can show, if anyone's interested, there's brand new Environmental Defense Fund workshop that was funded by the Bezos Foundation, looking at sort of the worldwide potential for carbon sequestration by seaweed. And I'm happy to pass out that reference to anyone who's interested. So the issue is, it's all about scale. And we're going to hear that word a lot today, because it is. It's what you can do on, in our case, a 2.5 acre seaweed farm is just very limited. It's because it's just not very big. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. They're raising hands, but I also want you to know that we've got a question from Tom Mumford that we want to read. So where do you want us to go first? Diane, one of our panelists. Okay, Diane.
Let's wake it
up. Just a couple of things, just what Joth was saying about corn. If you look at that study that we did that was published in 2018, I mean, just acre-wise, I don't want everybody's talking about carbon, but I want to talk about nutrients for people, for animals, for whatever. The seaweed is very good for protein production. We average about anywhere from 25, depending on the time of the year, 25 to about 29% protein content. Can't forget this. But turning back, and also we can way outproduce any corn per hectare. I mean, it's all in that report, so you can look at that of any corn production. But the other thing I wanted to mention is that the tank systems are actually a micro for what's happening in the macro. And when I first started, the university was kind of really like, I said, no, I'm going to put the fish with the plants. And they're like, whoa, everything will die. No, the trick is that you can learn a lot for what happens in the macro environment to look at what happens in tank culture, because it's about balancing. It's a biomass balancing. And it's been really educational for me to look at the variable things that affect the plants. And you can see everything happening right there. And so when we started, we were looking at something that was, I would say, we just didn't want to add anything. We wanted to at least be carbon neutral going back into the environment. I mean, John Colt has done a lot of work with kelp, so he'd be the one to speak to the impacts of kelp on carbon sequestration. I don't know, Meg, if you've gotten some of that stuff from him.
Hey, Diane, Diane, just for a second, we've got just 10 minutes left, and we've got many, many questions left. So if you want to wrap up your response to this question, then we'll move to the next.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that for studying carbon and speaking to Meg's issue of like, how do you measure everything? It's really good to have it in a micro sense in these large 1,200 gallon tanks, because then you actually can get an idea what the plant output is in terms of ratios. So
awesome. That's great.
Offering it out.
That's great. Okay, so the next question is from Tom Mumford, and it's how much emphasis has been given to overall carbon footprint of farm processing? And then with a question mark, carbon neutrality.
You could literally answer that, because that math was done for the...
But hopefully you're going to answer that.
Anyone in the audience want to chime in on that?
Does Tom know the answer?
No, the question is, has somebody looked at sort of the whole carbon footprint of the whole, the farming itself? How much fuel, how much plastic, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, what you're asking is sort of at the life cycle question. Not to my knowledge for certainly any farm in the Pacific Northwest, but you're absolutely right. The good news is that growing seaweeds uses virtually no fresh water. I mean, the actual production side looks great compared to, say, most other agricultural crops. No fertilizers, for example, are ever used, and it's very little fresh water. So that's on the plus side, but you're right. Fuels are used to access, harvest, and process the crop. So carbon neutrality, great question. Nope, but maybe down the road. And again, perhaps it's a scale question. So it's a good question.
Yeah, super important.
Life cycle analyses are needed.
P&L has done some of this for these big farms, but.
Phil, did you have an answer?
Yeah, so at least for the projects that are in King County, they do require a CO2 analysis as part of that. So the farm production itself is evaluated in the zoning process for projects in King County as far as fuel consumption and materials that are part of the farm. Now, the rest of the supply, the process of processing it, turning it into a product is not evaluated as part of that. The farm itself is.
Yeah, really good to remember that if carbon is one of the things you're hoping to achieve.
Can I just add to that real quick?
Of course.
Some other innovations would be solar energy, LED lights, dimmable LEDs in the nursery, electric engine, boat engines, direct seeding, something I'm just trialing this year, so cutting down on nursery times by doing direct seeding. And there's also another innovation coming down the pipeline called a macrophyte bioreactor, which is continuous gametophyte supply. It's like your nursery is all in this one unit, and there's a company in Canada producing bioreactors for microalgae, and now they've got a bioreactor for macroalgae gametophyte production. So that sort of streamlines your nursery and the energy and the time commitment of your nursery, and also it's biosecure. It plays into the footprint, and there you go.
Great. Okay, Tiffany.
I was just going to say, so I'm from the Nature Conservancy, and we actually are developing a model. Back to work. Yes. Hi. Okay, so from the Nature Conservancy, and we actually have developed a small model right now on the specific to British Columbia. Actually, looking at blue carbon of health, both from a natural and from a farming perspective. And that does look actually at the footprint and various LCAs and different products. So we're going into like a model 2.0 right now, where we're hoping to have that available to the public by this year. So we'll kind of be on the lookout for us. So that is work that's underway. We're tightening up a lot of those LCAs, but we want to make it something that the public can go in and actually play around and say, if I want to have 50% of my product go to food and 20% go to fertilizers, what does that look like from an overall carbon footprint perspective, including processing? Using literature as is the model, understand that it's not going to be completely accurate, but it will give us at least something to start.
Thank you very much for sharing that resource. Okay, so we've got, did you have a question?
I do have a question.
Okay.
There might have been others in front of me and Kyle.
You ask away.
Okay. My name's Sarah Tonda. I'm a graduate student at University of Washington, and this is kind of just a clarifying question for my own understanding. It's something that Taylor, that you said that kind of triggers this for me. You said that we should be seeking to return stewardship of land and water to indigenous peoples, and you also mentioned that you used a history of leases for seaweed farms to prove sovereignty and gain federal recognition. In New York, with the permitted area for a lease for a seaweed farm, I guess, are the leases for those areas to the state of New York's, like, Department of Natural Resources? Like here in Washington, anything coastal 3 miles and in that isn't in the tidelands, the leases for those areas in Washington, the money goes to Washington Department of Natural Resources. Is that also true in New York? And
do you see a legal avenue to these areas that are supposed to be co-managed to have money that is generated from leasing these areas go back to the tribes?
So that's a very good question. We have a bit of a different jurisdictional situation in New York. We have a very adversarial relationship with the New York State DEC, which is another thing I didn't get to mention, but it's a state agency. It was created in the 1970s. And one of the reasons why we do what we do is because our men who go out and fish and are known to fish whales and really be like you know, in the 1700s, when whaling was the industry that was the source of energy in the United States, no whaling ship left without a member of our tribe. That ended in a terrible tragedy when there was a shipwreck where most of our men in our tribe died, which then they tried to use against us to say we didn't exist anymore. But all of this to say that it's not respected by New York State. It's exploitative. Resource theft has always been an issue. So the situation, as I understand it, in Washington with co-management and acknowledgement of the tribe's treaty rights is significant compared to the situation in New York. We do what we do because we want to assert our sovereignty, but we do it cognizant of the fact that we could face litigation by New York State DEC. So their lease areas are leased already for aquaculture purposes in New York. So they're leased to mostly oyster farmers, and none of that revenue goes to the tribes at all. It's very inequitable, and I think that when we're looking at industries such as seaweed, which can be highly exploitative of not only the natural resource itself, but also of indigenous people of the region, you know, it's an issue for sure. And you know, not only that, but tribal nations and First Nations are the ones who are most impacted by the excess greenhouse gases that are here. So when we're talking about carbon and we're talking about tribes who are on the water and the coast, well, guess what? We're looking at having to relocate because the waters are rising, they're getting warmer, and we need to really, you know, think about sustainability, and we need to think about reforming our capitalistic nature and stop being so exploitative. And yes, this is an issue of scale, and we need to increase scale, but we need to do it with the input of indigenous people, so that we're respectful of not only the environment, but of each other and all of the marine life. And that includes resources. So a large part of what we do is we make sure that every one of our farmers is paid a living wage, and it's not economically exploitative. When we're designing our farm, where we go into it making sure that we're not going to increase the carbon footprint. We do shallow water kelp farming. When we do go out into deeper water, we use electric engines in our boats. Our hatchery is powered by solar energy. We do use like chillers for our hatchery, which are probably the most energy intensive aspect of what we're doing, but it is offset by solar energy. But you know, farm design, it's really critical. And when you get into like issues of scale and you're talking about doing seaweed farming commercially, like it's in the water, it's a huge issue that is going to have to be skillfully negotiated between those engaged in aquaculture and the tribes, and probably partnerships would be the best way to do this. And I would just encourage everyone to think of what you're doing as a potential model that others can follow, and really be cognizant of that when you're thinking about lease areas and where the revenue goes and what your carbon footprint is going to be and all of those things.
That is a beautiful way to close, so thank you for asking that question. There are many other really good questions, and I wish that we could discuss them together. I will pass these along to people so they can become part of the record, and hopefully we have a chance to answer them later. I just want to say thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you so much to Meg for organizing the panelists, and thank you to everybody for bringing your knowledge to the conversation as well. And I look forward to all the discussions this afternoon and to sharing lunch with all of you. And so, thank you.
All right, folks, the lunch hour is upon us. If you recall from this morning, we will start with folks who have any food allergies or special dietary restrictions. That does not include vegans or vegetarians. You're group 2. So if you know who you are, if you have a food allergy or a special restriction, gluten-free, dairy-free, et cetera. So go ahead and grab your spot in line, and then we'll wait a couple minutes and then have the vegetarians line up. Then we'll wait a couple more minutes and have us remaining omnivores line up.
It occurs to me that since talk amongst yourselves, enjoy.
It seemed to go low. We got one other Padlet follow-up question, but there are so many I decided to run a lot. Thank you.